Hey everyone, welcome back. Or maybe this is your very first time here. In which case, I am so glad you found your way to this little corner of the internet where we slow things down and let history carry us somewhere quiet. Tonight, we're going somewhere ancient, somewhere so old that the very idea of a book did not even exist yet. And yet people were already desperate to preserve their words, desperate to make sure that what they knew, what they felt, what they feared would not simply vanish when they were gone. Imagine this. You are holding an object in your hands. It is small enough to fit in your palm. It is made of nothing more glamorous than wet mud. The same mud you would find in any riverbank, in any field after a rainstorm. And yet pressed into the surface of that mud are thousands of tiny marks wedge-shaped and precise. Each one carrying meaning. Each one carrying a story. This is a book. Or rather, this is what a book looked like 4,000 years before Gutenberg ever touched a piece of metal type. Here is what I want you to sit with tonight. The very first books in human history were not fragile. They were not yellowed and brittle. They were heavy, dense, and in one of the great cosmic ironies of all time, they were made more permanent, not by being carefully preserved, but by being set on fire. How does that happen? And what does it tell us about just how badly human beings have always wanted to be remembered? Let us start at the very beginning. If you've been enjoying the journey here, the stories, the quiet, the feeling of history settling in around you like a warm blanket, it would mean the world to me if you took just a moment to subscribe to the channel. Give this video a like or leave a little comment below. I read them all, and I genuinely love knowing where you are watching from. Are you in bed, already on the couch with a cup of tea? Maybe somewhere halfway across the world where it is the middle of the afternoon and you just needed something to slow your brain down. Tell me, and now dim those lights a little. Let the fan hum in the background, and let tonight's story begin. We have to go back approximately 5,000 years. And when I say that, I want you to feel that number properly. 5,000 years. The Roman Empire had not happened yet. The pyramids of Egypt were still being built, or had only just been finished, and in a flat, muddy region between two rivers in what is now modern Iraq. A place the ancient Greeks would later call Mesopotamia, meaning simply the land between the rivers. Something extraordinary was beginning to happen. The Sumerians were keeping records, not stories yet, not poetry, not history, just numbers, counts of grain, lists of sheep, records of how much barley went in and how much barley came out. The very first written words in human history were essentially spreadsheets, which is either deeply disappointing or deeply relatable, depending on the kind of day you have had. But here is what is fascinating to write those records. The Sumerians had invented a system. They took a reed, the kind of tall, thick grass that grew in abundance along the Euphrates, and they cut it at an angle to create a pointed end. Then they pressed it into soft, damp clay, not drawing with it, pressing, stamping. Each mark was a tiny wedge shape, and by combining these wedge shapes in different arrangements, they could represent sounds, objects, ideas. This system became known as ununiform from the Latin word for wedge-shaped. And the medium, that flat palm-sized lump of clay, became the world's first page. Think about the practicality of it for a moment. Clay was absolutely everywhere in Mesopotamia. The Tigris and the Euphrates flooded their banks every year and left behind thick, fertile mud across the entire landscape. A scribe in ancient Sumer never ran out of raw material. He simply walked outside, scooped up a handful, shaped it into a tablet, smoothed the surface, and began to write. When he was finished, he could let it air dry, which made it hard enough to handle. For documents that needed to last official records, legal contracts, royal decrees. He would bake the tablet in a kiln, turning it from mud into something closer to ceramic. Something that, as it turned out, could last essentially forever. And when I say forever, I mean it. We have clay tablets today, sitting in museums that are over 4,000 years old, still readable, still intact. The words are still there. Compare that, if you will, to your last phone upgrade. But what were the Sumerians actually writing on these tablets? At first, as I said, accounting, commerce, the very unglamorous work of keeping track of who owed what to whom. But over time, something shifted. The scribes began to realize that the same system that could record numbers could also record sounds, and sounds could be strung together into words. And words could become something more than tallies. By around 2600 BC, roughly 4,000 years ago, the first recognizable literature was beginning to emerge from the clay. Love poetry, hymns to gods, instructions for brewing beer, and perhaps most remarkably, stories. One of those stories told of a great king named Gilgamesh, a man who was part god and part human, who went on a journey in search of immortality, and came back having found something more complicated and more true instead. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest surviving work of literature in human history. It is older than the Bible, older than Homer, older than anything else we have. And it was written on clay tablets, 12 of them each, about the size of a thick paperback novel. When you read it, and I would encourage you to someday, it does not feel like an ancient artifact. It feels like a human being writing about loneliness and friendship and grief and the terror of knowing that one day you will die. It feels exactly like what a book should feel like. Now, here's where the story takes one of those turns that history loves. To actually become a scribe in the ancient world, whether in Sumer, in Babylon, in Akkad, or later in Assyria, was not a small thing. It was a career that required years of training. In Mesopotamia, there were schools specifically for this purpose. They were called the Adubaba, which translates delightfully literally as the House of Tablets. The world's first schools were schools for writers. Students entered these schools as young as 8 years old. They would attend from sunrise to sunset roughly 24 days out of every 30 for the better part of a decade. Some sources suggest they graduated in their early 20s. They learned not just how to write, but how to write correctly, how to press the stylus at precisely the right angle, how to form each wedge with the right depth and orientation, how to memorize hundreds of signs and their combinations. And the discipline was, let us say, fairly traditional. Ancient texts describe students being beaten for being late, for speaking out of turn, for producing sloppy work. One school text written by a student who was clearly having an absolutely terrible day describes being caned by the teacher for poor handwriting. Even in 4000 BCE, someone was sending home a bad report card. Only the children of the wealthy could afford to attend. Only men in most cases. Though there is some evidence that in certain periods and places daughters of priests and merchants were occasionally allowed to study alongside the boys. The knowledge locked in those cuneiform signs was power, and power was not handed out freely. When a student completed his training, he did not just know how to copy texts. He was also expected to know mathematics, the languages of neighboring peoples, the proper format for legal contracts, and the correct forms of address when writing to a king. A fully trained scribe was something like a lawyer, an accountant, a translator, and an archivist all in one. He was indispensable, and he knew it. Now let's talk about a king, because the history of the clay tablet cannot be told without talking about one particular man. A man who took this entire tradition of writing and did something almost incomprehensibly ambitious with it. His name was Ashurbanipal. He ruled the Neo-Syrian Empire from around 668 BC, and he had an unusual distinction for a warrior king. He was actually literate not just nominally, not just symbolically. He could genuinely read and write. He described himself in his own words as a man who had solved complex mathematical calculations and studied the secret law of the entire scribal craft. He was, by the standards of his time and place, extraordinarily educated, and he decided to use that education to build something the world had never quite seen before, a systematic, organized, comprehensive library. He sent scribes across his entire empire, and it was a vast empire stretching from what is now Egypt to what is now Iran with a single instruction. Find everything that has been written and bring me a copy of it. Every myth, every hymn, every medical text, every astronomical observation, every divination record, every list of omens and their meanings, every story. His scribes traveled temples to private homes to royal archives, and they copied tablets by the thousands. He also, being a king, had access to certain persuasive tools that regular book collectors do not. When his armies conquered Babylonia during a civil war against his own brother, he used the opportunity to take some of the most valuable tablets from Babylonian libraries as what we might politely call war reparations. He was not above a little scholarly looting. The result was the royal library of Ashurbanipal in his capital city of Nineveh. At its height, it contained more than 30,000 clay tablets and fragments. Texts on medicine, mythology, history, science, poetry, geography, multiple copies of the Epic of Gilgamesh, star charts, dream interpretation manuals, recipes, correspondence, legal codes. It was organized. There were catalog labels. There were instructions at the bottom of tablets telling the librarian which shelf a misplaced text belonged on. It was by any reasonable measure the world's first great library 1,000 years before Alexandria. In 612 BCE, a coalition of Babylonian scions sacked the city of Nineveh and burned it to the ground. The palace collapsed. The library went up in flames. And here's the twist. The fire that destroyed the library also saved it. Because clay tablets, unlike papyrus or wood or anything organic, do not burn. They bake. The intense heat of the palace fire turned thousands of air-dried tablets into something harder, denser, and more permanent than they had ever been before. They were buried under the rubble of the destroyed city, where they sat for over 2,000 years, until a British archaeologist named Austin Henry Leard began digging at the site of Nineveh in the 1840s and 1850s. He found rooms filled floor to ceiling with fragments of clay. Most had been shattered by the collapse of the palace, but the writing was still there. The words were still legible. The fire that was meant to erase Ashurbanipal's library had instead preserved it. Today, more than 30,000 of those tablets and fragments are in the British Museum in London, and the historian H.G. Wells, looking at them, called this collection the most precious source of historical material in the world. Now, while all of this was happening in Mesopotamia, something very different was developing in Egypt. The Egyptians, of course, were no strangers to writing. They had their own system, hieroglyphics, which most of us have seen on the walls of temples and tombs, and they had been using it for nearly as long as the Sumerians had been pressing wedges into clay. But the Egyptians had something the Mesopotamians did not: the papyrus plant. Papyrus grew in thick, tall stands along the Nile Delta. The Egyptians discovered that if you cut the thick stem of this plant into long strips, layered those strips at right angles to each other, while still moist, and then pressed and dried, the result, you got a remarkably smooth, flexible writing surface, lighter than clay, far more portable, and you could roll it up. The scroll was born, and this changed everything about what writing could be. A clay tablet could only hold so much text before it became impractically heavy. A papyrus scroll could be as long as you needed it to be. It could travel. You could carry it under your arm across a city, across a desert. The world's first books were essentially architecture. They stayed where they were built. The scroll was the first book you could take with you. In ancient Egypt, the people who worked with these scrolls were held in extraordinary esteem. The word for scribe in Egyptian was sesh, which also carried connotations of someone who creates, who draws, who makes something real. A trained scribe in ancient Egypt occupied a position of significant social prestige. He was above laborers, above farmers, often above merchants. He answered to the pharaoh, to the temples, to the great administrative machine of the state. And to become one, you had to start very young. Egyptian scribal training could begin when a child was as young as 5 years old, entering temple schools, and the formal training in writing began around 9. Students spent years practicing, not on expensive papyrus. Papyrus cost money, but on limestone flakes and broken pottery shards called ostraca. You can think of them as the ancient equivalent of scratch paper. Only once a student had proven his skill was he permitted to practice on the real thing. What they were learning was genuinely difficult. The hieroglyphic writing system contained more than 1,000 distinct characters. The everyday administrative version, hieratic script, was somewhat simpler, but still required mastery of hundreds of signs. The training could last a decade or more. Many students did not complete it, but those who did found themselves able to move through the entire structure of Egyptian society in ways that simply were not possible for anyone else. A man who could read and write in ancient Egypt could become an architect, a tax collector, a court official, a doctor, an astronomer. One famous scribe, named Horemheb, came from a reasonably ordinary family. His parents were middle-ranking in their social standing, and through the power of his literacy alone, he eventually rose to become the last pharaoh of the 18th dynasty of Egypt. Not a minor position. Literacy in the ancient world was not just a skill, it was a superpower. So here's where we are at the end of this first chapter of our story. Long before anyone thought of parchment, long before monks bent over manuscripts by candlelight, long before Gutenberg set his first letter in a bed of movable type, human beings were already desperately, urgently writing things down. They were pressing reeds into mud and painting marks on a papyrus because they understood something fundamental. That knowledge stored only in a living mind dies when that mind does. That a story told only in spoken words changes a little every time it is passed on until it becomes something else entirely. That the only way to truly preserve something, to freeze it in time to send it forward into a future you would never see, was to find a way to make it physical, to give it a body. The clay tablet was clumsy. It was heavy. 30,000 tablets in one room is a lot of furniture, but it worked. And the words of Gilgamesh written down on those tablets more than 4,000 years ago are still here, still being read, still making people think about friendship and loss and what it means to want to live forever. If that is not proof that the obsession was worth it, I do not know what is. And now something is shifting in the story. Because as useful as clay was, and as elegant as papyrus turned out to be, both of them had limitations. Clay was permanent, but impossibly heavy. Papyrus was light, but fragile. It rotted. It dried out. It crumbled in humid climates. And it came from exactly one place in the entire world, the banks of the Nile in Egypt, which meant that the entire intellectual life of the Mediterranean world depended on the goodwill of one civilization to keep the scrolls coming. What happens when that supply gets cut off? It turns out, desperation, magnificent, surprisingly effective desperation. And the solution to that problem was something that would change the nature of the book entirely. That would make it possible to write on both sides of a surface, to fold it, to stack it, to bind it, to make for the first time something that looked almost like what you and I would recognize today. It came from an unexpected source, and it required something far more intimate than mud from a riverbank. It required skin. Something has been quietly bothering me about the story we ended with in part 1, and I think it should bother you a little too. Because here's the thing. Clay is extraordinary. Clay survived fire. Clay is sitting in the British Museum right now with words on it that are 4,000 years old, still perfectly legible. And papyrus, as we saw, gave Egypt a kind of intellectual superpower, the ability to write on something light enough to carry, flexible enough to roll up, smooth enough to take ink beautifully. But papyrus had a problem, a very specific, very geopolitical problem. And that problem is what I want to start with tonight, because it led to one of the most dramatic turning points in the entire history of the written word. A moment that involved the king's wounded pride, a diplomatic embargo, and the unlikely solution of writing on dead animals. Stay with me. This gets strange. Let's set the scene. It is the 2nd century before the Common Era, and the Mediterranean world is in the grip of what we might generously call an academic arms race. On one side, Alexandria in Egypt, home to the most famous library the world had ever seen, a place so ambitious. Its founders genuinely wanted to collect every book that had ever been written in every language on earth. On the other side, Pergamon, a rival kingdom in what is now Western Turkey, whose kings had decided that they too wanted a great library. They too wanted to be a center of learning, and they too wanted the prestige that came with having shelves full of the world's knowledge. The trouble was that both cities needed the same thing to fill those shelves: papyrus. And papyrus came from exactly one place in the world, the Nile Delta. Egypt had held a monopoly on papyrus production for centuries. The method of making it was a closely guarded royal secret. The plant itself, the Cyperus papyrus reed, grew in great swaying stands along the Nile, and the Egyptians had turned it into a remarkably refined product sheets of material that were lightweight, smooth, portable, and durable enough to survive the dry Egyptian climate for thousands of years. Our English word paper comes directly from the word papyrus. The word Bible traces back through Greek to Byblo, the name of a Phoenician port town that was once a major trading point for this material. The entire vocabulary of the written word in Western languages carries traces of this one Egyptian plant. And for a while, everyone just accepted that if you wanted to write something significant, you needed to get your papyrus from Egypt. And Egypt was going to decide how much you could have and what you paid for it, until the day the Egyptians decided to cut Pergamon off entirely. Around 197 before the Common Era, the Egyptian ruler Ptolemy V, apparently alarmed by just how quickly Pergamon's library was growing, imposed an embargo on papyrus exports to Pergamon. The message was fairly blunt: no papyrus for you. Without writing material, the scholars of Pergamon could not copy manuscripts. Without copies, the library could not grow. Without a growing library, Pergamon could not compete. It was an intellectual blockade. And it was clever. What happened next was even cleverer. Forced to find an alternative, the scholars and craftspeople of Pergamon turned to something they already had in abundance: animal skin. People have been writing on prepared animal hides for centuries in various parts of the world. There are references to writing on skin going back to ancient Egypt and the Near East. But what Pergamon developed was a more refined, more systematic process. They refined their technique for treating and stretching and scraping animal skins until they produced something of genuinely high quality. A smooth, durable, two-sided writing surface that did not crack or crumble, that could be made anywhere in the world without relying on a plant that only grew in one country, and that lasted under the right conditions for an almost unimaginable length of time. We call it parchment, and the word itself, in the medieval Latin phrase pergamena, is simply the word for Pergamon. The entire history of the medieval manuscript tradition, the illuminated codices the monks bent over their work in cold scriptoriums, the Book of Kells, the Lindisfarne Gospels, all of it traces back at least in part to the moment when a king in Turkey got annoyed that Egypt had cut off his paper supply. I think about that sometimes. The history of knowledge is not always driven by great philosophical breakthroughs. Sometimes it is driven by trade disputes and wounded egos. But let us stay in Alexandria for a moment, because the story of what happened there is one that I keep coming back to. Not just for what it tells us about books, but for what it tells us about the human obsession with owning knowledge. The Library of Alexandria was founded around 295 before the Common Era under the patronage of Ptolemy I, and it grew under his successors into something that had no real precedent in the ancient world. The Ptolemaic kings were, by all historical accounts, absolutely fanatical about acquiring books. They sent agents across the Mediterranean with enormous budgets and instructions to buy every text they could find: Greek, Egyptian, Persian, Hebrew, Indian, anything written down in any language. They wanted, according to one ancient source, all the books in the world. That was the literal stated goal. What makes this fascinating is not just the ambition, but the methods they used to pursue it. Have you ever had a library book confiscated? I do not mean overdue. I mean genuinely taken from you, kept, and replaced with a copy. That is exactly what the TMIC rulers of Egypt did to ships arriving in Alexandria's harbor. Under orders from the library, customs officials would board incoming vessels and search them for books. If books were found, they were taken to the library, copied by trained scribes, and then the original was kept. The copy went back to the ship. If the owner wanted compensation, they might receive some. If they did not, that was also fine. The label attached to these confiscated collections inside the library read, "From the ships." There is something both admirable and troubling about that. These were people who believed passionately and sincerely that knowledge belonged to everyone, that gathering texts from across the world and making them accessible to scholars was a genuine act of civilization building. The library welcomed researchers from across the Greek-speaking world, gave them stipends to live on, and freed them to study whatever they wished. The mathematician Eratosthenes, who calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy, using nothing more than a stick and some geometric reasoning, worked there. Aristarchus, who first proposed that the planets orbit the sun nearly 2,000 years before Copernicus, worked there. But the books that got them to those discoveries, some of them were taken. One of the most famous stories involves Ptolemy III borrowing the original manuscripts of the great Greek playwrights Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides from the Athenians. These were stored in the state archives of Athens and were considered precious national treasures. The Athenians agreed to lend them, but only after Ptolemy deposited the enormous sum of 15 talents of silver as a guarantee they would be returned safely. Ptolemy kept the originals, sent back copies, willingly forfeited the 15 talents, which was an absolutely staggering amount of money by any measure. The Athenians, one assumes, were not pleased. But what could they do? He had the originals. By its peak, the Library of Alexandria held somewhere between 40,000 and perhaps 500,000 scrolls. The ancient sources disagree wildly and honestly. The uncertainty might tell us something about just how overwhelming the place felt to anyone who walked into it. An inscription above the entrance to the reading room reportedly read, "The place of the cure of the soul." I find that remarkable. Not a place of study, not a place of scholarship, a place of healing. Someone who worked there, a librarian named Calamicus, created the world's first systematic subject catalog, a massive index called the Pine Keys, which means the tablets or the tables. It ran to 120 scrolls of its own. It recorded not just what books the library had, but the author's birthplace, their teachers, the first line of each work, a short biography, a note on the authenticity of the text, and even where the book had come from, whether purchased, borrowed, or as the case sometimes was taken from a ship. Calmicus organized all of knowledge into 8 categories: oratory history laws, philosophy, medicine, lyric, poetry, tragedy, and miscellany. Think about that for a moment. One person, one extraordinarily systematic, almost obsessive human being sat down and tried to organize every written thing that existed in the known world into 8 boxes. That is either the most inspiring act of intellectual ambition I have ever heard of, or it is the most Egyptian thing imaginable, and possibly both. Now, here's where I want to slow down and spend some time, because there is a turn in this story that most people miss entirely. We talk about the destruction of the Library of Alexandria as if it were a single catastrophic event, a fire, a burning, a loss. The dramatic image most people carry is of Roman soldiers or later armies setting the whole thing ablaze in one night. And there is something seductive about that image. I understand. It is clean. It is tragic. It gives us someone to be angry at. But the historical reality is considerably more complicated and considerably sadder. Julius Caesar did set fire to ships in Alexandria's harbor in 48 before the Common Era, and that fire did spread, and some portion of the library's collection, perhaps tens of thousands of scrolls, was probably lost. Seneca the Younger, writing about a century later, claimed 40,000 scrolls burned. Some ancient historians say more, but what the sources also make clear is that the library kept functioning after Caesar's fire. Scholars visited it for generations afterward. There are references to it in texts written well into the Common Era. What actually happened to the Library of Alexandria is something more like what happens to all great institutions. Eventually, it declined slowly through neglect and shifting political priorities and reduced funding and the steady attrition of years. The later Ptolemaic rulers were less interested in books than their predecessors had been. Roman emperors supported it unevenly, some generously, some not at all. Religious tensions in Alexandria during the late Roman period drove scholars away. By the time Arab forces arrived in the 7th century of the Common Era, and later accounts claim they finished it off, there is strong evidence the great collection had already largely ceased to exist in any coherent form. The Library of Alexandria was not murdered. It faded. And I think that is, if anything, more heartbreaking than the fire. But something else was happening during this long, slow decline of the scroll. Something that would permanently change the shape of the book as an object, and change who could use it and how. Around the 1st century of the Common Era, a new format was beginning to appear quietly, almost apologetically, in the margins of the Roman world. The Romans had long used wooden tablets, small wax-covered boards hinged together as notebooks for everyday writing, accounts, letters, rough drafts, things you did not need to keep forever. At some point, someone had the idea of replacing the wooden boards with sheets of papyrus or parchment, folding them, stacking them, and stitching them together along one edge. The result was what we now call the Codex, which is essentially the book as you know it today. The Roman poet Martial, writing in the 1st century of the Common Era, was one of the first writers to publish his works explicitly in Codex form, and he was enthusiastically promotional about it. He pointed out that a Codex of his poetry could fit comfortably in one hand, could travel anywhere, could be read without a second pair of hands to manage the unrolling, and contained far more text per unit of size than a scroll. Assign your book boxes to the great he with characteristic Roman cheekiness. This copy of me one hand can grasp. The Codex had practical advantages that once you see them feel almost obvious. A scroll could only be written on one side, or if written on both sides, could only really be read on one side at a time. A Codex used both sides of every page, which meant you got roughly twice as much text from the same amount of material. A scroll had to be unrolled, which required 2 hands and some physical coordination. If you were in the middle of a long text and needed to find a specific passage, you had to unroll the whole thing to get there. A codex you could simply flip to. The difference between navigating a long scroll and navigating a book with pages is the difference between rewinding a tape and skipping a chapter. And yet, despite these obvious advantages, the transition from scroll to codex took centuries. The Greco-Roman literary establishment was deeply attached to the scroll as the form of serious literature. To put a real work of philosophy or history or poetry into a codex was for a long time considered slightly undignified, like publishing something important in a pamphlet instead of a bound volume. The group that changed everything with remarkable speed and conviction was the early Christians. From the very beginning of their movement, Christian texts appear almost exclusively in codex form. Scholars have studied the surviving fragments of early Christian literature, and the numbers are striking. Roughly 80% of early Christian manuscripts were codices in an era when the broader literary culture was still producing most serious texts as scrolls. The Christians chose the codex deliberately, emphatically, and early. Why scholars have debated this for decades. One argument is purely practical. The Gospels, and especially any attempt to collect multiple Gospels together, were simply too long for a single scroll. A scroll containing all 4 Gospels would need to stretch nearly 30 m, far beyond the maximum practical length for a reading scroll. A codex could hold all 4 bound together in a single volume you could carry under your arm. For a community that moved around, constantly preached, taught from their texts, referenced different passages in quick succession. During services, the codex was simply a better tool. There is also an argument about identity. By choosing a format that was distinct from the scrolls of Jewish synagogues and from the scrolls of pagan literature, Christian communities were in a subtle but visible way marking their texts as something different, something new. When someone in the Roman world saw a codex, there was a good chance for a while that it contained Christian writing. And over the course of the 3rd, 4th, and 5th centuries of the Common Era, the codex spread first through Christian communities, then into the broader reading culture until by the 6th century, the scroll had almost entirely vanished from use in European book production. The format that had carried human thought for over 1,000 years, the long-rolled papyrus or parchment scroll that you can see in every painting of a Roman senator and every statue of a Greek philosopher, was simply gone, replaced by pages, replaced by a book you could hold in one hand and navigate with a thumb. St. Augustine, writing in the 4th century, describes a famous moment in his garden, the moment of his conversion. He heard a voice saying, "Take up and read." He grabbed the nearest book and opened it at random to a passage from Paul's letters that changed his life. The scholars who have thought carefully about this scene point out he cannot have done that with a scroll. You cannot grab a scroll and flip it open at a random page. That moment of conversion, that instinctive, spontaneous opening of a book, was made possible by the codex. So, where does this leave us? What we have traced across the span of roughly 4,000 years is a series of remarkable, sometimes accidental, sometimes politically driven transformations in how human beings chose to give their words a body. From clay in Mesopotamia, heavy, permanent, fireproof, to papyrus in Egypt, light, elegant, dependent on a single country's goodwill, to parchment in Pergamon, born from an embargo made from skin durable enough to outlast empires. And finally to the codex, a format so useful, so logical, so obviously suited to how we actually read and navigate text that it has remained essentially unchanged for 1,600 years. We still use it right now. Whatever book you last picked up and held in your hands, that is a codex. The shape of the thing has not changed since the time of the Roman Empire. There is something quietly wonderful about that. I think underneath all the centuries of technological change, underneath the printing press and the typewriter and the digital screen, the basic idea stack, the pages, bind them on one side, let someone flip through them at their own pace, has proven itself so well that nobody's found a reason to discard it. But here's what I keep thinking about as we sit with this history. All of it, the clay, the papyrus, the parchment, the codex, was still at this point in our story extraordinarily rare, extraordinarily expensive. In the world we've just moved through, if you wanted to read something, you needed to be wealthy or connected or lucky. You needed access to a library whose rulers decided to let you in. You needed scrolls that merchants had not confiscated or texts that some court official had not locked away. The question of who got to hold knowledge, who got to touch it, read it, pass it on, that question had barely been asked yet. The scroll and the codex were revolutionary objects, but they were still objects owned by the few. That is about to change. And the change begins in the most unlikely place. In the cold, silent, dimly lit room of a monastery, where a man sits alone with a piece of skin, a reed pen, and a task that might take him years to complete. What he is doing in that room, what it cost him, what it meant, and the deeply strange things he sometimes wrote in the margins when he thought no one was looking. That is where we are going next. Picture the scene for just a moment. It is somewhere in the 8th or 9th century, deep in the Irish or Frankish countryside. Dawn is barely broken. A man wraps his robe tighter against the cold, and in the unheated stone room where he spends the better part of his waking hours, the cold is very real. He sits down at a slanted wooden desk. He picks up a quill. He dips it in ink, and then for the next 6 hours, in near total silence, he does something that to us would seem almost incomprehensible in its patience. He copies by hand, word by word, letter by letter, a text that he may or may not understand in a language that may or may not be his own, on sheets of material made from the scraped and stretched skin of animals. He does this every day for years. This is the medieval scribe, and the room where he works is called the scriptorum. And if you're listening to this tonight, if you have ever held a book, ever read a poem that was written before the 15th century, ever encountered the words of Cicero or Virgil or any of the church fathers, you're in some very real and direct sense holding the fruit of his labor. Let us talk about what that labor actually looked like. The word scriptorum is Latin. It simply means a place for writing. But in the context of medieval Europe, roughly from the 6th century through to the rise of universities in the 12th and 13th centuries, it referred to something far more specific. The room, or sometimes just the corner, or sometimes just the individual cell in a monastery where books were made. I want to be careful here not to paint too uniform a picture, because the truth is that medieval monasteries differed enormously from one another, and so did their scriptoria. Some of the great abbeys had large purpose-built rooms with rows of desks arranged for maximum light from the narrow windows. Others had monks working in individual stone cells, each with a slanted desk, an inkwell, and enough space to turn around. The Benedictine abbeys of Germany and Italy tended toward the communal model. The Carthusians, committed to solitude as a spiritual principle, had each monk copy in his own separate cell, entirely alone. Different orders, different approaches, but the same fundamental task. What they shared was the silence, by formal rule in many orders. And the Cistercians made this explicit as early as 1134. The scriptorum was to be as quiet as the cloister itself. Absolutely no conversation. And because asking for something by speaking was forbidden, the monks developed an elaborate sign language just to communicate what they needed. If a scribe wanted to consult another book, he would extend his hands and mime turning pages, then add a gesture indicating the content, a circle around the ear for a book on music perhaps, or the hand shape to suggest a cup for a liturgical text. A whole silent vocabulary developed entirely to serve the needs of men who spent their lives reproducing words they could not speak aloud. There is something both beautiful and quietly absurd about that, and I've been thinking about it for a while. Here were men whose entire purpose was to preserve and transmit language, and they were not allowed to use it. Candles were forbidden in most cases because the risk of fire was simply too catastrophic to take in a room full of irreplaceable manuscripts. This meant that work happened only in daylight, roughly 6 hours a day in winter, somewhat more in summer. Every monastery year was therefore a race between the available light and the ever-growing list of texts that needed to be copied. The physical demands of the work were genuinely severe. Medieval accounts are full of complaints about what sustained copying to the body. And I want to read you a few of these, because they are, I think, one of the most unexpectedly moving things I have ever encountered in the history of books. One 10th century prior writing about the condition of his scribes described it like this: "Only try to do it yourself, and you will learn how arduous is the writer's task. It dims your eyes, makes your back ache, and knits your chest and belly together. It is a terrible ordeal for the whole body." And a 10th century monk named Florentius of Valoranica, completing a manuscript he had spent enormous time on, left this plea at the end of his work: "Because one who does not know how to write thinks it no labor." I will describe it for you if you want to know how great is the burden of writing it miss the eyes. It curves the back. It breaks the belly and the ribs. It fills the kidneys with pain and the body with all kinds of suffering. Therefore, turn the pages slowly, reader, and keep your fingers well away from the pages. That last instruction, keep your fingers away from the pages, tells you everything you need to know about how precious a finished book was years of labor. And he is asking you, please not to smudge it with your fingers. Now, here's where the story gets interesting in a way I did not entirely expect when I first started researching this. Because while the official version of the scriptorum is one of sacred silence and disciplined piety, monks cheerfully dedicating their labors to God, every letter, a prayer, every page, a wound inflicted on Satan. As Cassiodorus once declared, the actual experience of being a medieval scribe was often considerably less serene. We know this because of what they left in the margins. Medieval manuscripts are full of what scholars call marginalia notes written in the borders of the page, usually in spaces the main text did not fill. Most of these are scholarly annotations, references, translations of difficult words, but some of them are something else entirely. Some of them are the raw, unfiltered voices of men who are cold, hungry, exhausted, bored, and not entirely sure the task was worth it. These are real. These are preserved in manuscripts in libraries across Europe, and they are wonderful. One scribe wrote simply, "I am very cold." Another finishing a particularly long text left behind. As the harbor is welcome to the sailor, so is the last line to the scribe. One monk suffering through a difficult parchment noted in the margin, "The parchment is hairy," which if you have been paying attention you will remember was not a trivial complaint. Bad parchment meant the ink did not sit properly, which meant hours of work might be ruined. Another, the ink is thin. And my personal favorite left by an anonymous scribe at the end of a completed manuscript in Latin. Now I have written the whole thing. For Christ's sake, give me a drink. That man lived 12,200 years ago, and I feel like I know him. I feel like I would have absolutely sat next to him in a pub and understood every single thing he was feeling. One Irish scribe writing somewhere around the 9th century composed what might be the earliest recorded complaint about writer's cramp in human history. A short poem about his own hand. He wrote about how his quill had a tapered point, how the ink ran blue-dark from it, and how his hand ached and cramped from the endless work. He ended the poem by describing himself as just a small, runny pen going through books through thick and thin, and the final line added by a translator centuries later with considerable affection ran, "Now I've written the whole thing. For Christ's sake, roll me a joint," which is not, I should clarify, the original translation, but does capture the spirit with reasonable accuracy. What strikes me about all of this is not the humor funny as it is. What strikes me is that these people were aware with absolute clarity of what they were doing and why it mattered. One scribe wrote, "This is a sad little book. A day will come in truth when someone over your page will say the hand that wrote, it is no more." He was right. His hand is gone, but the page remains and someone is still reading it. That is not nothing. That is arguably everything. Let's talk for a moment about the man who is perhaps most responsible for the entire tradition we're describing, though he is not, I suspect, a name most people would recognize. His name is Cassiodorus, and his story is one I find genuinely fascinating because it is a story about a very powerful man who chose at the height of his influence to walk away from everything and spend the rest of his very long life. He lived to roughly 93 years old, which is remarkable for the 6th century by any measure, making sure the books did not disappear. Cassiodorus was a Roman statesman. He had served as one of the chief advisors to Theodoric the Great, the Ostrogothic king who controlled Italy after the fall of the Western Roman Empire. He drafted royal letters and state documents. He held some of the highest offices available to a man in 6th century Italy. And then around the year 540, when the world he had served was collapsing under the weight of the Gothic wars, he retired. He went home to his family's estate in the very southern tip of Italy near a town called Squilis, and he built a monastery. He called it the Vivarium, Latin for fish pond, because there were ponds on the estate where fish were kept, which is either a wonderfully humble name for one of the most consequential institutions in the history of Western culture, or a sign that Cassiodorus had a very specific sense of what mattered and what did not. At the Vivarium, Cassiodorus did something that had not quite been done before in this form. He made the copying and preservation of manuscripts not an incidental activity of monastery life, something done by the infirm or the inexperienced when they had nothing better to do, but the central defining purpose of the community. He wrote an instruction manual for his monks, the institutions, which laid out not just which text should be copied, but how. He emphasized accuracy above all. Check your copy against the original. Do not change the words, even if the grammar seems wrong to you. He built a library. He installed a sundial and a water clock so the monks could manage their time precisely. He even built what the sources describe as a perpetual lamp, an oil lamp that fed itself from a reservoir and never went out, so that the library was never in total darkness. His collection at vivarium included works of medicine, philosophy, theology, classical poetry, and history. He had works of Hippocrates, works of Cicero, works of the church fathers alongside works of the pagan classical world shelved together without embarrassment. The vivarium was, for its brief lifespan, the most systematically organized institution for book preservation in early medieval Europe. When Cassiodorus died around 585, the monastery did not long survive him. The manuscripts were dispersed. Some ended up in Rome. Others moved through the monastery network across Italy and into the broader European world. And the example he set that a monastery's highest duty included the active systematic preservation of the written path spread through Benedictine houses in Germany, through Irish monasteries that carried texts across the sea, to Britain through the great abbeys of France and the Rhine Valley. The vivarium's model became the standard. Before Cassiodorus, copying was a job for whoever had the time. After him, it was a vocation, and it is worth asking for a moment, what exactly were they copying? What texts were making their way through this vast, slow network of cold rooms and cramped hands and hairy parchment and thin ink? The answer is more complicated and more surprising than most people expect. Obviously, the Bible, multiple copies and multiple versions, liturgical books for the church services, the writings of the church fathers Augustine, Jerome, Gregory. All of this was the core business of any monastic scriptorum. But alongside the sacred text, something else was being copied. Quietly, sometimes almost apologetically, but consistently, the pagan classical world. Virgil, Ovid, Cicero, Pliny, Horace, Livy. These were the works of men who had lived and died before Christianity existed. Men whose religion involved multiple gods and sacrifices, and augury men whose politics involved slavery and empire, and a kind of brutality that no monk could entirely endorse. And yet their texts were being copied in monastery after monastery across the darkest centuries of European history. Why? The answers are various. Some monks genuinely found beauty and truth in the classical authors, and saw no contradiction between that beauty and their faith. Others argued, following Augustine, that a thorough education in classical rhetoric and logic was a necessary preparation for understanding Scripture. Others may simply have recognized with a pragmatism that history has fully vindicated that if they did not copy these texts, nobody else would. One scholar writing centuries later about the miracle of medieval manuscript culture put it this way: because of the work of these monks, the medieval world never had to start from scratch. Everything they needed to rediscover the logic of Aristotle, the poetry of Virgil, the science of Pliny was waiting for them on the shelves. That phrase has stayed with me. They never had to start from scratch, and neither because of them did we. There's one more thing I want to tell you about the scriptorum before we move on, because I think it changes how you see the whole picture. We tend to imagine the scribes as men, monks, brothers, priests, a world entirely male. And for the most part, in the great monastic centers of the early and high Middle Ages, this is accurate enough. The famous scriptoria of Tours of Monte Cassino of Fuller, these were male communities, but there were women. Nuns and female monasteries ran their own scriptoria. The Abbey of Chelles in France, run by a succession of abbessones in the 7th and 8th centuries, was a known center of manuscript production. We know of individual women who worked as scribes, sometimes identified by their siphons, the brief notes they added at the end of a finished manuscript. One nun, named to be working in a monastery in Bergen in the 12th century, signed her psalter with characteristic modesty, writing, "B wrote this psalter with initials, although not as well as I ought." And recently, in one of the more extraordinary scientific discoveries to emerge from manuscript studies in recent years, archaeologists examining the teeth of a woman, buried at a German monastery in the 11th or 12th century, found something surprising. Tiny flecks of ultramarine blue pigment, the kind made from lapis lazuli embedded in the dental calculus. The only way that pigment could have gotten there was if she'd been licking the tip of her brush while painting, a habit well documented among manuscript illuminators who would touch the brush to their tongue to keep the tip pointed while working. That woman was never named in any document. She left no colophon, no record, no complaint in any margin. But her teeth told a story. She was there. She was doing this. She was making books. The history of the scriptorum is full of silences. Sometimes because the rules demanded quiet. Sometimes because the records simply did not survive. But underneath those silences, if you look carefully enough, you find the ordinary, extraordinary lives of people who spent themselves in service of something they believed mattered. Not just the text they were told to copy, but the strange, irreplaceable, and deeply human act of making sure that what had been thought and felt and discovered would last. What the scriptorum could not solve, though, was one of the oldest problems in the history of books, the problem of beauty. Because at the same time that monks were bent over their desks copying word after patient word into plain, functional manuscripts meant for study somewhere else in the monastery, or sometimes in the same room, something entirely different was happening. Colors were being ground from stones. Gold was being laid on a parchment, so thin you could see light through it. Insects and plants and hunting scenes and saints and dragons and tiny microscopic jokes were being painted with brushes made from single animal hairs. The illuminated manuscript is one of the most astonishing things a human being has ever made. And what went into creating one? The science, the obsession, the extraordinary cost is a story that deserves its own careful telling, which is exactly where we are headed next. There's a question I keep turning over in my mind, and I want to ask it directly before we go any further. Why do they bother? Because here's what we know at this point in our story. Making a book before the printing press was already one of the most demanding, expensive, physically punishing things a human being could undertake. The parchment alone cost an enormous amount. We will talk more about that cost in a later chapter. The years of silent labor in cold rooms, the risk of error, the back pain, the cramped hands. A single completed Bible produced honestly and carefully could represent an entire year or more of one man's life, and still that was just the text. What on earth possessed anyone to then take that finished page, that hard-won page, and begin applying gold to it? The answer, I think, has to do with a belief that was as serious and sincere as anything the medieval world produced. That the Word of God deserved the most beautiful container human hands could make. That beauty itself was a form of theology. That when the light caught a page of gilded vellum, and it seemed briefly to shine from within, that shimmer was not decoration. It was a statement about what truth was worth. And they were willing to pay for it with their time, their health, and their finest materials, including some that had to travel 5,000 m to reach them. Let us start with what we mean when we say illuminated manuscript, because the word is more interesting than it first sounds. The Latin root is illuminer, to light up, to make bright. When a medieval artist applied gold or silver leaf to a page and then burnished it until it gleamed, the effect under candlelight or daylight was genuinely striking. The page appeared to glow, not metaphorically, literally. The gold caught the light from any angle and threw it back at the reader. In a world that had no electricity, no glass to amplify daylight, and depended entirely on flames for illumination after dark, an object that seemed to generate its own radiance was extraordinary, sacred even. But the word also carried a deeper meaning. Illumination in the theological sense meant the light of God entering the mind of the believer. And so the illuminated manuscript was for the people who made and used them. A physical embodiment of that idea, the Word of God written on the most precious material available, decorated with the most expensive colors in the world, bound in wood and leather, and sometimes jeweled metal. All of it creating an object whose outward beauty was meant to signal the inward light of its contents. This is not decoration for its own sake. This is a civilization speaking in its own most serious visual language. So, how was it actually done? What was the physical, technical, step-by-step reality of producing one of these objects? The process is considerably more complex than most people imagine, and it involves a level of collaboration that challenges the romantic image of a single monk alone with his work. Once the scribe had finished writing the text, working in carefully ruled columns on prepared vellum, leaving blank spaces where images or decorated initials were planned, the completed pages would be passed to a second specialist, the illuminator, also called a rubricator or miniator, depending on what exactly they were responsible for. These were different people with different skills, trained in entirely different disciplines. The scribe needed a steady, consistent hand and deep knowledge of the text. The illuminator needed something closer to what we would now call chemistry, combined with fine art. Before any color could go on the page, the illuminator had to lay the gold. And this is where the technical complexity becomes genuinely fascinating. Gold leaf, real gold, beaten until it was thinner than anything you can imagine, thinner than paper, thinner than silk, could not simply be stuck on a vellum. The surface needed a foundation. The illuminator would prepare a mixture called gesso chalk or gypsum ground fine combined with water and a binding agent, sometimes glue, sometimes a touch of red clay, called Armenian bole. This mixture would be painted carefully onto the areas where gold was intended to go, not as a flat coat, but slightly raised, giving the gold a three-dimensional quality when it was applied. Then the whole thing had to dry to exactly the right consistency. Not too wet, not too hard. The illuminator would breathe on it, literally breathe on it, to slightly reactivate the surface, and then lay the gold leaf hair by hair using tools made from quills or fine brushes. Once the gold was down, the burnishing could begin. A dog's tooth mounted on a handle was the traditional tool, smooth, hard curve, just right. The illuminator would work it over the gold in small, careful, repetitive strokes until the surface transformed from dull to brilliant. In the right light, finished gold leaf in a medieval manuscript does not look applied. It looks as if the gold is somehow inside the page, glowing upward through the vellum. Only after the gold was complete could the painting begin, because applying color near fresh gilding risked contaminating it, and the gold had to be in place first so that any surrounding painted areas could be worked right up to its edges. Now the paints themselves. This is where the geography of the medieval world enters the picture in a way that still astonishes me. The colors on a medieval illuminated manuscript were not mixed from simple dyes or house paints. They were ground from specific stones, insects, plants, and minerals, some of which had to be sourced from half a world away. Red was relatively accessible. Red ochre and iron oxide found throughout Europe gave a warm, earthy tone. Vermilion, a brilliant opaque red, was made from grinding cinnabar, a toxic mercury sulfide mineral. Beautiful, but hazardous to the people who worked with it daily. Red lead gave another range of warm hues. These reds appear throughout manuscripts and rubrics. The chapter headings and titles written in red, which is why we still call a section of directions or rules a rubric today. Green came from malachite or from verdigris, a compound that formed when copper was exposed to acid, which gave a bright, slightly unstable green that could darken with age. Yellow came from ochres, or sometimes from a material called orpiment, which was arsenic sulfide brilliant yellow, but so toxic that grinding it had to be done with great caution, and it could not be mixed with lead white without the two pigments reacting against each other. Medieval illuminators were in a very real sense amateur chemists, navigating a palette full of hazards. But the most expensive color, the one that tells you more than anything else about the reach and the wealth of medieval manuscript culture, was blue. Specifically, ultramarine blue. The name means quite literally from beyond the sea. And the reason for that name is simple. The only source of this particular shade of blue in the medieval world was a single region of what is now Afghanistan, the Sarasang mines in the Badakhshan Mountains, where a semi-precious stone called lapis lazuli was extracted from the earth. Lapis lazuli is a deep, intensely blue stone flecked with gold from traces of pyrite. People have valued it for thousands of years. Ancient Egyptian craftsmen used it for jewelry. Mesopotamian traders exchanged it across the ancient world, and Chinese, Indian, and Persian artisans all worked with it. But the medieval European artists who used it to make ultramarine pigment were doing something even more labor-intensive. To produce the paint, raw lapis lazuli first had to make the journey from Afghanistan across Central Asia through the trading networks of the Islamic world over the Alps, or through Mediterranean ports to reach the workshops of Europe. That journey alone might take months and pass through a dozen pairs of hands. When it finally arrived, it had to be ground fine, then mixed with warm water and wax and pine resin, then kneaded and separated repeatedly to extract the pure lazurite crystals, the fraction of the stone that actually held the brilliant blue from the other minerals it was mixed with. The process was wasteful, slow, and demanded enormous skill. The resulting pigment was gram for gram as expensive as gold. And this is why in medieval paintings and manuscripts, the color blue was reserved for the most sacred subjects. The robes of the Virgin Mary are blue almost universally in medieval European art, not as an aesthetic choice, but as a statement of value. The most important figure in the image wore the most expensive color. When you see that vivid, specific shade of blue on a 13th or 14th century illuminated page, you're looking at the labor of miners in Afghanistan, traders across the Silk Road, and an illuminator in France or England who handled this material with the reverence it demanded. Is that not extraordinary? A pigment that travels 5,000 m to end up on a book that one person, maybe two, will ever read? And yet they did it repeatedly for centuries. Of all the illuminated manuscripts that survive, there are a few that seem to stop every person who encounters them, not because of any scholarly argument or historical context, but simply because of what they are, because of what they look like. One of them is the Lindisfarne Gospels. It was made on a small island off the northeast coast of England, Lindisfarne, sometimes called Holy Island, around the year 715. Most scholars believe it was primarily the work of a single monk named IDF, who became Bishop of Lindisfarne in 698. He may have begun the manuscript to honor the memory of Saint Cuthbert, a beloved bishop whose remains were kept at the monastery, whether Edfrith worked alone or with occasional assistance. What he produced is something that people who work with medieval manuscripts professionally describe with a kind of controlled reverence that tells you everything about its impact. One page alone, a single carpet page, as they are called, the full-page geometric and zoomorphic compositions that precede each gospel, contains more than 10,000 individually placed red dots arranged in precise decorative patterns around the borders of interlacing knotwork, not drawn, placed one by one. The Lindisfarne Gospels used a range of pigments, reds from red lead and kermes, yellows from ornament, greens from verdigris, blues from indigo, and possibly imported materials. The colored inks for the text itself run to purple, red, and gold. Every page reveals something new under a magnifying glass. A hidden animal in a knot, a face worked into a border, a detail so small it should not have been possible to place there with the tools available. This was not a book meant for daily reading. It was a display piece, an act of devotion on the same scale as building a cathedral. It was meant to say without words, look what we are willing to do. Look how much this costs us. Look what we believe this text deserves. The other manuscript I want to tell you about is the one that is in some ways more mysterious and more debated than almost any other object in the history of books. The Book of Kells, created sometime around the year 800, most likely on the island of Iona off the Scottish coast before being carried to Kells in Ireland to keep it safe from Viking raids. It is now housed at Trinity College, Dublin, where roughly 1 million people visit it each year, which makes it perhaps the most viewed medieval artifact in the world. Its 400 or so surviving pages contain the 4 Gospels in Latin, preceded by tables and summaries, and decorated with illustrations and ornamental initials of a density and complexity that generations of scholars have struggled to fully describe. The 12th century writer Giraldus Cambrinis, who claimed to have seen it, wrote that the Book of Kells was so intricate, so perfectly made that it appeared to be the work of an angel, not of a man. He described how the closer he looked, the more he found spirals within spirals, not work that seemed to have no beginning or end. Faces emerging from decorative letters, animals intertwined in patterns so complex they defy description. Modern examination has confirmed that the Book of Kells was made by at least 3 distinct scribes identified only as Hand B and Hand C, who may have worked on it at different times and possibly in different locations. There is evidence it was never fully finished. Some pages have spaces left blank where illustrations were planned but never completed, though it is also possible those pages were simply lost. What those three hands made together is something that still makes art historians go quiet. On what is called the Cairo page, the page where the abbreviation for the name of Christ first appears in the narrative, modern microscopists using magnification have found details that no human eye working by candlelight with the tools of the 9th century should have been able to place with precision. Interlaced, not work where the individual strands are the width of a single hair. Animals so small they are invisible without a lens. Some researchers have genuinely puzzled over how this was accomplished. The tools available at the time, quills, fine brushes made from individual animal hair, should not have been capable of producing lines of this fineness. The working theory is not that something supernatural was involved, but that the people who made it trained for years to a level of fine motor control that we have essentially no modern frame of reference for. They could see it, their hands could do it, and they believed it was worth doing. Here is something worth sitting with, though. While we rightly marvel at the visual impact of illuminated manuscripts and the economic and geographic networks that produce them, there is a question that the manuscripts themselves sometimes seem to be asking quietly. Who is all of this for? The Book of Kells is believed to have been a display object for the altar, not a reading book, a ceremonial one. It was shown, not studied. Its pages were meant to be seen at a distance, held aloft during services, their golden color, catching what light was available, and communicating to a congregation, most of whom could not read something wordless, that the text of the Gospels was precious beyond measure. The Lindisfarne Gospels, similarly, was an object of veneration as much as scholarship, and I find this genuinely moving if I am honest. These were communities where the vast majority of people were illiterate. The book as a container of text was for most of them literally inaccessible, and yet the response was not to give up on the object. It was to make the object so beautiful that its importance could be communicated without words, to pour into it every expensive material, every technique of making light and color, every hour of the most skilled human attention available, so that even someone who could not read a single letter of the Latin inside would look at it and understand this is the most important thing we have. That is a remarkable thing to do with a book. Of course, not every illuminated manuscript was made for the altar. By the 12th and 13th centuries, something was beginning to shift in who could own books and what kinds of books existed to be owned. The rise of universities across Europe was creating a new kind of demand, not for ceremonial display books, but for practical, workable texts that students could actually use. The art of illumination would adapt to serve that new world. But the economics of who paid for it, who controlled access to it, and who was allowed to read the results, that story is darker and stranger than the beauty of the pages might suggest. Because a book that costs as much as a house to make is not a tool of the people. It is a tool of whoever has the money to commission it. And in medieval Europe, that question of who commanded the books, who decided what was written in them, who was allowed inside the libraries where they were kept, shaped the entire intellectual landscape of a civilization. And that quietly is where we are heading next. We have been looking at what went onto the pages. The gold, the lapis lazuli, the vermilion, the extraordinary human patience that placed 10,000 red dots into a single decorative border. But there is a question we have not yet asked directly, and it is one that tends to stop people cold when they hear the answer. What exactly were the pages made of? Because the pages of the Book of Kells, those glowing, otherworldly, luminous pages, are not paper. They're not papyrus. They're the stretched and scraped and dried skins of 185 young calves. 185. To make the Book of Kells, someone had to saw, slaughter, skin, lime treat, stretch, scrape, and prepare the hides of 185 individual animals. Researchers who have studied the manuscript estimate that this would have required a herd of approximately 1,200 cattle, an enormous commitment of agricultural resources for any medieval community, let alone a small island monastery in the 9th century. The Lindisfarne Gospels required approximately 150 calf skins. The Winchester Bible, a 12th century English masterwork, used around 250. The Codex Gigas, the largest medieval manuscript known to survive a staggering monastic Bible, so heavy it requires 2 people to lift, reportedly require the hides of 160 donkeys. Do you ever think about a book and wonder what it really cost the world to exist? Sit with that question for a moment as we explore what was behind every beautiful page. The process of turning an animal's skin into a writing surface is one that most people, quite understandably, would prefer not to think about in detail. But understanding it is essential to understanding the medieval manuscript, because parchment was not just a material choice. It was an economic commitment, an agricultural infrastructure, and a craft tradition passed down through generations of extremely skilled and largely unappreciated specialists. The raw material could come from sheep, goats, or calves. Calf skin, called vellum from the Latin word for calf, was the finest and most expensive. Sheepskin and goat skin produced parchment of varying quality, depending on the age and condition of the animal. A skilled parchment maker could tell from handling a raw skin exactly what it would yield. The process began with soaking. The fresh skin was submerged in a bath of water and lime calcium hydroxide for several days. The alkaline solution loosened the hair follicles and the surface layer of fat and flesh, making both easier to remove. This part of the process was, by all historical accounts, extraordinarily unpleasant. The lime bath smelled appalling. Medieval cities and monasteries that needed to produce parchment in quantity kept their tanning pits downstream and downwind of the main buildings whenever possible. A legal record from 14th century England notes that parchment makers, along with butchers, tanners, and fat renderers, were specifically banned from setting up shop within city walls. After soaking, the skin was removed from the lime bath and stretched on a wooden frame called a hearse. Here the real skill began. While the skin was still wet and pliable, the parchment maker would work over it repeatedly with a curved two-handled blade called a linellum, scraping away the remaining flesh and fat from one side, and then the fur and outer membrane from the other. The trick was maintaining the right tension on the frame as the skin dried. Too little tension, and the skin would wrinkle and pucker. Too much, and it would tear. The maker had to keep adjusting the cords that held the skin stretched, tightening them as the skin contracted and drying, relaxing them if they sensed the material was near its breaking point. Done well, the result was a surface of extraordinary smoothness and consistency. Vellum made from the skin of a young calf could be scraped thin enough to allow light to pass through it. The expensive uterine vellum, once thought to come from unborn calves, was actually simply very young animals worked with exceptional skill to achieve almost translucent thinness. The finest vellum had a quality of cool, slightly ivory-cold smoothness that no papers ever quite replicated. It took ink differently. It aged differently. It had a presence of physical weight and substance that reflected the living creature it had once been. Now, here's where the story gets complicated in a way I want you to sit with. The monks who made the Book of Kells, who spent years of their lives bending over those pages, placing those dots, mixing those pigments, were not unaware of the origin of their material. Medieval people were not squeamish about the relationship between life and death in the way that modern urban cultures sometimes are. Animals were slaughtered regularly, their carcasses used for food, their hides for clothing and shoes and binding straps, their bones for tools. But a book was different. A book was not just a container for words. A book was in the medieval theological imagination, a vessel for the Word of God. And the paradox of that vessel being made from the body of a dead creature was not lost on the people who made and used them. A 10th century old English riddle from the Exit Book addresses this directly, and I find it one of the most remarkable things in the entire corpus of medieval literature. The riddle is spoken in the voice of the parchment itself, a creature who describes its own story. An enemy came and took away its world's strength. It was stripped of its outer covering, scraped and soaked and stretched. It was written upon with the feathers of birds dipped in dark water. And then in the final lines it says, "Now I am of more service to people than ever that creature was who first gave me this form." The riddle's answer, of course, is a manuscript book. That 10th century writer understood something profound. The animal's life had ended. But what the animal had become by passing through the hands of the parchment maker and the scribe and the illuminator had a power the living creature never had. It could carry the Gospels across 1,000 years. This is not a comfortable idea for modern sensibilities. We live in an age that rightly pays more attention to what we take from other creatures. But I think it is worth sitting with a medieval perspective for a moment without judgment, because it reveals something important about how they understood what a book was. A book was not just ink on processed material. It was a transformation, something animal becoming something sacred, something mortal, carrying something eternal. The practical economics of parchment production shaped every aspect of medieval manuscript culture because the material was so expensive and so labor-intensive to produce. Every inch of it was precious. Scribes planned their page layouts with extraordinary care to waste as little space as possible. If a piece of parchment had a natural flaw, a small hole where the skin had been thin, or a rough patch where a scar had been, scribes would simply write around it, incorporating the defect into the page design as a small blank area. You can see these adjustments in surviving manuscripts today. Little windows of silence in the middle of lines of text. Parchment was also reused when the text on a page was no longer needed or when the community simply needed fresh writing material and had none available. Old manuscripts were scraped clean and written over again. These recycled pages are called palimpsests from the Greek, word meaning scraped again. The layers of earlier writing often remain faintly visible beneath the newer text and modern imaging technology. Ultraviolet light, multispectral scanning. X-ray fluorescence has revealed startling quantities of earlier texts hidden beneath later ones. Some of the most important ancient documents known to survive do so only because they were scraped and reused. The original text ghosted, but not entirely erased. Between the 7th and 9th centuries, according to historical accounts, enormous numbers of earlier parchment manuscripts were scrubbed and scoured to provide fresh writing surfaces. And in many cases, the earlier writing can still be partially read. We will never know what was lost in those scrapings. We only know what survived underneath. The question of where a medieval community got its parchment varied by time, place, and resources. In the early medieval period, larger monasteries often produced their own. The process was unpleasant and space-consuming, but it gave the community direct control over the quality of their material. By the 12th and 13th centuries, as secular commercial activity grew, professional parchment makers became a recognized urban trade. And by the 14th century, in cities like Paris and London, they had organized into guilds with formal regulations about quality and pricing. A student at a medieval university would typically buy their parchment from a stationer near the university district. The same stationer who might also rent them pierced sections of the text they needed to copy. The price varied considerably, depending on quality, size, and the local market. But even ordinary parchment was never cheap. The calculation always came down to the fundamental reality. Before you could write a word, an animal had to die. This is why medieval books were so ferociously protected. This is why they were chained to reading desks. This is why scribes added book curses, threatening divine punishment to thieves. This is why Vespasiano de Bistici spent 14 years assembling a library of 900 volumes, because each of those 900 volumes had required a small herd's worth of animals processed by skilled craftspeople, stretched and dried and scraped to the correct smoothness, transported to a scriptorium, and then committed to months of a trained human being's most careful attention. And yet, and here's what I find genuinely moving about all of this, none of that cost stopped them. Not the smell of the lime pits, not the physical difficulty of stretching and scraping, not the expense, not the years it took. When a community decided that a text was worth preserving, or that a saint deserved a worthy memorial, or that God's word deserved the finest possible container, they simply did what was necessary. They kept 1,200 cows. They scraped 185 hides. They mixed the pigments and prepared the gold and sat down in the cold light of a stone room and began to write. The result is sitting in Trinity College, Dublin, right now, under climate-controlled glass, being visited by about 1 million people every year. It is over 200 years old. The vellum is still smooth and legible. The colors have barely faded. The gold still catches the light. 185 calves became something that outlasted the civilization that made it. There's a natural question that arises from all of this, and I want to turn toward it before we leave this chapter. If the pages were this expensive and the pigments this rare and the gold this precious and the entire process this demanding, then who exactly was doing the actual work of putting all these elements together? Not the illuminators we met in the last chapter who added the decoration after the fact. I mean the people who first prepared the page, who picked up the quill, who dipped it in the ink and set it to the vellum, and began letter by patient letter to fill the white surface with the text that made all of the beauty possible. The scribes had tools, and those tools, the quill, the ink, the knife, the ruled lines, the specific scripts they were trained to produce are a story in themselves. A story of chemistry and craft, and 1,000 years of slowly refined technique. A story with a surprising political dimension, and one rather remarkable emperor who did more than almost anyone in history to shape the letters you are reading right now. That is where we're going next. There is something I want you to try for just a moment before we go any further. Hold up your hand and look at it. 5 fingers, small joints, the kind of hand that can hold a pen, a phone, a cup of tea. Now, imagine holding something fragile and sharp at the tip of those fingers, a quill cut carefully to a fine point, and pressing it to a surface of ivory white animal skin and beginning to write. Not quickly, not carelessly the way we type emails now, but slowly, deliberately, one stroke at a time, with the knowledge that each small mistake could ruin hours of work, that the ink cannot be erased like pencil, that the material under your hand costs more than you earn in a month. That was the daily reality of the medieval scribe. We have talked about where they worked the scriptorum, the silence, the cold. We have talked about what they wrote on the parchment that required hundreds of animal lives to produce. And we've talked about what they added to that surface, the gold leaf, the lapis lazuli, the pigments that traveled 5,000 m to reach a cold monastery in Ireland. But we have not yet talked about the tools actually in their hands, the things without which none of those pages could exist. That is the story for tonight. Let us begin with the simplest thing, the thing you have certainly seen in illustrations, even if you have never thought about it carefully. The quill pen. The quill. The quill pen was the primary writing instrument of Europe for roughly 1,300 years, from about the 6th century of the Common Era until metal-nibbed pens began to be mass-produced in Great Britain in the early 19th century. Let that span settle in for a moment. Everything written in Latin, in English, in French, in German, in dozens of other languages throughout the Middle Ages passed through the tip of a feather. But, and this is something that surprised me when I first looked into it, not just any feather would do. Not even close. The best quills came from the first 5 out of flight feathers of a goose. Specifically, the primary flight feathers, the largest and outermost ones from each wing. These particular feathers have a shaft that is long, hollow inside, and just the right combination of flexibility and stiffness when properly prepared. Swan feathers were considered even better. A swan quill, some historical sources note, would outlast 50 goose quills. But swans were expensive and not always available. Goose was the standard, the workhorse of 1,000 years of writing. You could not simply pick a feather up from the ground and start writing. That is not how it worked. First, the feather had to be cured, hardened, and stabilized through a process that changed the structure of the material inside the shaft. The most common method was to thrust the barrel of the feather into hot sand or hot ash, stirring it continuously until the inner membrane softened. Then the craftsman removed it quickly, pressed it flat on a hard surface with the back of the pen knife, and allowed it to cool. The heat altered the horn-like material inside, making the finished quill harder, stiffer, and less prone to splitting under the pressure of writing. Some scribes used hot water instead. Others used a technique called dutching, soaking the barrel in water first, then plunging it rapidly into hot sand. Each practitioner had his own preferred method, and they guarded it with the same secrecy a blacksmith guards his formula for tempering steel. Once cured, the cutting could begin, and here is where genuine skill was required. The scribe used a small knife called a pen knife, a term we still use today for a folding pocket knife, though we have long forgotten its original purpose to shape the tip of the feather into a writing nib. The process involved multiple precise cuts, an angled cut at the end of the shaft to create an oval opening, a series of shaping cuts to bring the sides down to a narrow shoulder, and finally a slit, a thin, precise cut running down the center of the finished nib toward the tip. That slit is everything. It creates a capillary channel so small that ink flows through it in controlled drops enough to write, but not enough to blob onto the page uncontrollably. The length of the slit, the width of the nib, the angle of the final cut, all of these affected the character of the line, produced how thick or thin, how flexible, how suited to the particular script the scribe had been trained to write. And here's something I find genuinely remarkable. There are no written instructions anywhere in medieval literature for how to cut a quill pen. Scholars have searched exhaustively through medieval manuscripts and have found hundreds of recipes for making ink, careful instructions for preparing parchment, detailed discussions of pigment mixing, but not one text explaining step by step how to cut a quill. The reason researchers believe is that cutting a quill was so universally known to literate people that nobody thought to write it down. It was transmitted from teacher to student, from older scribe to younger monk, generation after generation, for over 1,000 years without ever being committed to parchment. The keepers of human knowledge had one crucial piece of knowledge they never wrote down. There is something quietly wonderful and slightly absurd about that. Now let's talk about ink. Perhaps nothing in the entire history of book production receives less attention than ink. We look at beautiful manuscript pages and think about the hand that held the pen, about the vellum, about the vivid colors. But ink is just ink, isn't it? Not quite. The primary ink of the medieval world is called iron gore ink, sometimes also called oak gall ink. It was not purchased from a shop. It was cooked from three things: oak galls, iron, and tree resin. To understand why oak galls, you need to know what they actually are. Those small round growths you sometimes see on oak branches, they look a bit like small hard berries, are not fruit of any kind. They're the nests of G. wasp larvae. A female gall wasp pierces the bark of a young oak twig and lays her eggs underneath. When a larvae hatch, they secrete a chemical irritant that causes the tree to grow a protective woody sphere around them. When a larva has developed into a full wasp, it chews its way out through the wall of the ghoul. The flesh of these ghouls is extraordinarily rich in tannic acid and gallic acid, two substances that are chemically crucial to making ink. The scribe would collect these ghouls, crush them, and soak them in water, wine, or vinegar, sometimes boiling them to extract the acid more efficiently. Then iron vitriol was added, iron sulfate, usually obtained as a byproduct of mining operations for silver, copper, or tin. The chemical reaction was immediate. The tannic acid bonded with the iron to form iron tannate, a compound that is intensely colored and remarkably stable. Finally, gum arabic, a resin harvested from acacia trees in Africa and the Middle East, was added as a thickening and binding agent, giving the ink its flow and adhesion. A recipe for this ink from a 15th century Cambridge manuscript reads, in Middle English, that still makes its instructions perfectly clear. Take an ounce of ghouls, an ounce of gum, and an ounce of green copper, that is iron sulfate. Crush them all together almost a powder. Put them in a pot. Add a pint of rainwater. Stir it every day, and within 3 days you shall have good ink. Simple enough and extraordinarily effective. Iron gall ink does not merely sit on the surface of the parchment. It chemically bonds with the structure of the animal skin at molecular level, forming a true chemical union with the material. This is why you can open a manuscript written in the 9th or 10th century, over 1,200 years old, and the letters are still sharp, still legible, still black. Not because someone preserved them with extraordinary care, but because the chemistry of the ink itself is genuinely durable. There is, however, a complication. Fresh iron gall ink is not black. It is a faint, watery gray purple. It darkens and deepens as the iron oxidizes on contact with air, the same process that turns iron to rust. This means a scribe writing in iron gall ink could not fully assess the quality of his work by eye until the ink had dried and oxidized. What looked faint and uncertain on the fresh page might darken into perfectly confident script, or it might not. And there is one more problem that only became apparent over centuries. The acid in iron ghoul ink continues to work on the parchment beneath the letters long after the writing is done. It eats very slowly into the material it was written on. Many medieval manuscripts today have tiny holes appearing directly beneath the oldest and heaviest lines of ink, places where centuries of acidic action have finally worn through the material. The scribes who made iron garlic did not know this would happen. They had chosen the most permanent seeming substance they could find, and that very permanence carried within it the seed of slow self-destruction. There's something profoundly human about that. But there's a larger question about writing that I want to posit here, because it is often overlooked in stories about medieval manuscripts. How do they actually write? Not in terms of tools, but in terms of the shapes of the letters, the visible language of the page. Because this is something few people realize. For nearly 1,000 years of the Middle Ages, there was no unified standard for how to write Latin letters in Europe. Every region, every country, every monastery developed its own style. A manuscript from Ireland looked entirely different from a manuscript of the same period from Italy. A page from Spain could be difficult to read for a scholar trained in Germany. Early medieval handwriting was a maze of local styles, personal abbreviations, and unwritten conventions. This meant that every manuscript copy was not only unique in content, it was unique in visual language and the handwriting style that embodied it. And then around the end of the 8th century, one man decided to fix that. His name was Charlemagne. I know Charlemagne is not the name you're expecting in a story about writing tools, but hear me out. Charlemagne, king of the Franks, later Holy Roman Emperor, had an ambition to unify and reorganize his entire kingdom, including its systems of education and book production. He summoned a scholar named Alcuin of York from England and made him head of the Palace Academy. And one of the most important projects Alcuin oversaw with the direct and enthusiastic support of the emperor was the creation of a new, clearer, more unified style of handwriting that could serve the entire empire. The result of this project developed through many monasteries, but perfected especially at Tours under Alcuin's direction, was Caroline minuscule, or Carolean minuscule. And I want you to understand why this was a genuinely astonishing achievement in the history of writing. Caroline minuscule was consciously designed to be easy to read, not beautiful easy to read. The letters were written separately from one another rather than joined. They had consistent sizes, clear forms, unambiguous shapes. Spacing between words was standardized. A hierarchy was created, larger, more formal scripts for headings and titles. Caroline minuscule for the main body of text. The result was a page that looked more than anything before it in the history of Western writing like what we would recognize today. And its influence did not stop with Charlemagne's reign. Over 7,000 manuscripts written in Caroline minuscule from the 8th and 9th centuries survive to the present day, an enormous number compared to what survives from earlier periods. And then there's a fact so remarkable it borders on irony. When the scholars of the 15th century Renaissance began searching for ancient Roman manuscripts to use as models for their new printed typefaces, they found many of them written in Caroline minuscule. They mistook it for genuine Roman script, something authentically ancient. They were wrong. The style was only 7 or 8 centuries old, but that mistake led them to base their new humanist typefaces on Caroline minuscule. And the typefaces they created from that mistake, what they called humanist minuscule, are the direct ancestors of the lowercase letters you're reading right now. The lowercase letters in every book printed today, in every digital screen in the document you might be reading this on, they came from those anonymous monks in Tours and Archon, sitting in cold rooms, carefully shaping each stroke with a cured goose quill, trying to fulfill Charlemagne's instruction for clarity and uniformity. Can you feel that every time you look at a lowercase letter, an A, a G, an N, you're looking at the direct inheritance of a nameless scribe working 1,200 years ago? But there is one more thing I want to mention before we leave this subject. Something small, seemingly technical, but actually one of the most important things a scribe did. It is the preparation of the page before writing. A medieval manuscript did not begin with a blank sheet and a person picking up a pen. Every sheet of vellum or parchment had to be carefully prepared. First came scraping one final pass with a pen knife to ensure the surface was perfectly smooth and even. Then came pricking using a pointed implement to make tiny holes at regular intervals along both margins of the page. These holes serve as reference points. Then a straight edge or hard point was used to rule faint lines connecting the holes across the page, creating the system of guidelines the scribe would write along. This process is called ruling, and it is significant enough that by studying the pattern of those pricked holes and ruled lines on a manuscript, researchers today can identify not just which monastery produced it, but sometimes the specific individual scribe, because each person had their own habitual spacing, their own characteristic distances between lines, their own way of dividing the page. Tiny holes along the margin of a page, faint lines scored with a hard point. They are the invisible signature of whoever made the book, the faint fingerprint of someone who lived and worked and left something behind 1,000 years ago. And here's what I think matters most in everything we have covered tonight. This entire system of tools, the quill, the ink, the penknife, the ruled lines, every technical refinement worked out across centuries of trial and accumulation did not exist in a vacuum. It existed in the context of a culture that believed transmitting words from one generation to the next was one of the most important things a human being could do. I sometimes think about Charlemagne, an emperor famous for being unable to write fluently. His biographer, Einhard, records that he kept wax tablets and practice boards under his pillow at night, so that when he woke in the dark, he could practice forming letters. He worked at learning to write for the rest of his life, and never quite mastered it. And this same man created a revolution in how handwriting was standardized across an entire continent. Perhaps precisely because he could not write well, he understood better than anyone how the shapes of letters, clear or ambiguous, consistent or chaotic, determined who could read and understand them. That is a very human lesson. This story of tools and technique leads us toward a much larger question that we have not quite faced yet. Because all of these beautiful tools and all of this accumulated skill, all of it served someone. Someone read the pages that were created. Someone had access to the libraries where the finished books were kept. Someone controlled who could approach them and who could not. The story of who commanded the books, who held the keys to the libraries, who decided what was written in them, and what extraordinary lengths ordinary people went to in order to touch those pages. That is what we are heading toward next. Something rather personal happened to me while researching this series, and I want to share it before we go further. I was reading through a collection of medieval book curses, and I had fully expected to find them mildly interesting in an academic kind of way, the way you find old laws about not letting geese on the town square mildly interesting. Instead, I found myself laughing out loud at my desk. Then I found myself moved in a way I did not entirely expect, because what these curses are when you strip away the Latin and the medieval syntax and the theatrical invocations of divine punishment is something very simple and very human. They are the sound of someone who worked incredibly hard on something precious, who knew that the world was not always fair, and who decided to fight back with the only weapon they had, the words. That is a feeling I suspect every single person who has ever made something has felt. Let's talk about the curses. First, some context. A medieval book, as we've established over these past hours together, was not just an object. It was an investment of years, sometimes many years of one person's life, combined with the hides of hundreds of animals, the rarest pigments from the furthest reaches of the known world, and enough ink made from oak ghouls and iron salt to stain a river. A single large Bible in the 12th or 13th century might cost as much as a small house. A library of 100 books, 100 represented an almost inconceivable accumulation of resources. Stealing a book in the Middle Ages was not like stealing a paperback from a shop. It was closer in terms of real value lost to stealing someone's car, or their horse, or possibly their horse, their cart, and their entire year's harvest combined. And yet books were stolen frequently enough that practically every monastery with a library had to think seriously about security. And the security measures they deployed are in retrospect a fascinating window into how medieval people thought about property sanctity and the power of language. The first line of defense was physical. Many monasteries chained their books directly to reading desks or shelves. Heavy iron chains, sometimes quite long, so the reader could actually carry the book across a room while attached to it, but short enough to prevent removal from the building. Some libraries required books to be stored in locked chests when not in use. A few particularly valuable manuscripts had locking clasps on the cover itself, not just to keep the pages from warping in humidity, but to discourage anyone from opening them without permission. Trust in God, as one medieval saying went, but lock up your books. But here's the thing about chains and locks. They work only when the books are physically in the building. A determined thief, a dishonest borrower, a visiting scholar who felt that his need for this text was greater than the monastery's need to keep it. None of these were reliably deterred by hardware alone, and so the scribes reached for something more powerful, something that would travel with the book wherever it went, something that would work even if the chain was broken, even if the lock was picked, even if the theft happened at midnight when nobody was watching. They wrote curses into the pages. The practice is old, much older than the Christian Middle Ages. The library of Ashur-Barnapple in Nineveh, which we talked about in the very first part of the series, had curses inscribed on its clay tablets, warning that anyone who removed a tablet and claimed it as his own would be overthrown by the gods in wrath and anger, his name and posterity destroyed. That was the 7th century before. The Common Era. The same instinct, The same appeal to divine enforcement runs through 3,000 years of human book culture. But the medieval European scribes brought to this tradition a particular flair, a creativity, sometimes a dark humor that reads, even now, as genuinely funny. A historian named Mark Den spent years collecting these curses and published a remarkable book about them in 1983. What he found was hundreds of examples ranging from the simple to the elaborately theatrical. And together, they paint one of the most vivid portraits we have of what a medieval scribe actually felt about the work they did. The simplest curses were just statements of ownership with a threat attached. This book belongs to St. Alban. May whosoever steals it from him or destroys its title be anathema. Amen. Anathema excommunication from the church was the nuclear option of medieval religious punishment. It meant being formally cut off from the sacraments from burial and consecrated ground from the community of Christian believers. In a world where virtually everyone's social and spiritual life was structured around the church, this was not a trivial threat. This was you'll be alone forever in this life, and possibly the next. But many scribes were not content with just that. They wanted specificity, vivid detail, the kind of curse that would make a would-be thief actually pause sweat a little and put the book back on the shelf. At the end of a Bible written around the year 1172, the scribe concluded with this: if anyone take away this book, let him die the death. Let it be fried in a pan. Let the falling sickness and fever seize him. Let it be broken on the wheel and hanged. Amen. There is no ambiguity there. No wiggle room for interpretation. The scribe is not asking politely. He has enumerated the punishments in ascending order of unpleasantness and concluded with a calm and final amen that is doing enormous work. Another curse, this one written in both Latin and German by a scribe who apparently wanted to cover his linguistic bases, goes like this: to steal this book, if you should try it, is by the throat you will hang high, and ravens then will gather about to find your eyes and pull them out. And when you're screaming, oh, remember you deserve this. Whoa, that scribe was something of a poet, a dark one, certainly, but a poet. And then there is perhaps my personal favorite, not for its graphic content, but for what it reveals about the mind of the person who wrote it. One curse tracked down by drone describes a truly comprehensive series of calamities awaiting the thief. The book shall change to a serpent in his hand and rend him. He shall be struck with palsy. All his members shall be blasted. He shall languish in pain, crying aloud for mercy with no cease to his agony, till he sings in dissolution. And finally, let bookworms gnaw his entrails in token of the worm that dieth not. Bookworms, literal bookworms, gnawing his entrails. Someone in the 12th or 13th century found it appropriate and deeply satisfying to invoke the same creatures that destroyed books as the instrument of punishment for book thieves. That is a kind of poetic justice so specific that it could only have come from someone who had personally discovered a beloved manuscript half-eaten by insects and needed somewhere to put their grief and anger. But here is a wonderful historical wrinkle that I think is genuinely delightful. Curses pose an awkward legal and moral problem when books legitimately changed hands. Because a book that said, "Whoever steals this book shall be anathema," did not distinguish between someone who stole it and someone who bought it, received it as a gift, or came into possession of it through entirely honest means. This led to some genuinely uncomfortable situations. In 1327, the Bishop of Exat, a man named John d'Andesol, who was by all accounts a perfectly upright ecclesiastical administrator, acquired a book that contained the following inscription: "This book belongs to St. Mary of Robert's Bridge. Whoever steals it or sells it, or takes it away from this house in any way or injures it, let him be anathema marinatha." Anathema marinatha, for the record, was the most serious form of the curse. The standard anathema intensified by the addition of a Syriac phrase, meaning the Lord has come, which implied not just excommunication, but direct divine judgment. The bishop confronted with this inscription added his own note directly below it, and his note said, "I, John, Bishop of Exat, do not know where the said house is. I did not steal this book, but got it lawfully." He was essentially arguing with a book curse from a century and a half earlier, and writing in the margin on the page directly below the curse itself. I find this somehow profoundly human. A bishop of the 14th century church, confronted with the threat of divine punishment, chose to respond with documentary evidence of his innocence. He could not interview the scribe who wrote the curse. He could not call the original monastery. So he left his own statement for the record, just in case. Now, let us shift from the dramatic to the technical. Because the story of mistakes in medieval manuscripts is not just about theft and curses. It is also about something much quieter, and in its way, just as consequential the ways that errors crept into the text itself during copying and what those errors reveal. Every person who has ever retyped a long document from another source understands the fundamental problem. The eye is unreliable. It skips. It wanders. It recognizes patterns and fills them in from memory rather than from what is actually on the page. The human brain is spectacularly good at many things, and one of them is seeing what it expects to see rather than what is actually there. Medieval scribes had exactly this problem, and they had it in conditions considerably worse than a modern office. Poor lighting, cramped positions, cold hands, minds drifting between the text in front of them and the prayers they were also required to attend, and sometimes working in a language that was not their native tongue. Scholars who study medieval manuscripts have given names to all the different ways copying could go wrong. There is haplography, when the scribe wrote once what appeared twice in the original, because his eye slipped from the first occurrence to the second and skipped everything in between. There is detoraphy, the opposite, writing twice what appeared once, because the eye drifted back and wrote the same phrase again. There is a phenomenon called homeotolin, which means the scribe's eye jumped from one line ending to a different line with the same ending, skipping everything in between. Sometimes several lines, sometimes an entire paragraph. These are not rare. They're extremely common. In fact, if you examine almost any medieval manuscript carefully, you will find evidence of at least some of these errors, sometimes caught and corrected by the scribe, or a proofreader, sometimes not caught at all and copied faithfully into the next generation of texts. And this is where it gets genuinely fascinating if you are willing to follow me into slightly more technical territory for a moment. When the same error appears in two different manuscripts, not just a similar error, but the exact same one in the exact same place in the text, that is not coincidence, that is evidence of dissent. It means those two manuscripts were copied from the same source or from sources that share a common ancestor. The mistake frozen in both copies, like a genetic mutation, proves their relationship. 19th century scholars realized this and developed what they called stemmacoticum, essentially a family tree of manuscripts built by tracking shared errors. By identifying which mistakes appear in which texts, you can reconstruct the history of how a work was transmitted across centuries, which monastery copied from which scriptorum was the source for a whole branch of the tradition, where a corrupt copy spread and poisoned dozens of subsequent texts. Errors, in other words, are not just mistakes. They are evidence. They are the forensic record of a transmission history that might otherwise be entirely invisible. And this leads me to one of the most extraordinary things in the entire history of medieval manuscripts. Something that demonstrates just how consequential a single copying error could be, not just for one text, but potentially for the understanding of a major theological question. There is a famous example in the copying history of the New Testament. In the first letter of Timothy chapter 3:16, there appears in some manuscripts the Latin phrase manifesto emiti sacramentum. And the crucial question is whether the following word is thus meaning God, or meaning who God was manifest in the flesh versus who was manifest in the flesh. A small difference in letter forms, a tiny adjustment in how a Greek letter was abbreviated, and between those two readings lies a significant difference in theological emphasis. The error, such as it is, entered the tradition early and spread through many subsequent copies before being caught and debated. Scholars have spent centuries arguing about it. What began as a scribe's misreading of a letter form or possibly a deliberate change, we cannot be entirely sure became embedded in the textual tradition of one of the world's most important religious texts. That is how much power a single slip of the pen could have. But I want to end this section on a note that I find unexpectedly moving. Because for all the errors and all the thefts and all the curses and all the cold mornings and cramped hands, there is one category of thing that medieval scribes added to their pages that was not a complaint, not a warning, not an error, and not a curse. Sometimes at the very end of a manuscript in the space, called the colophon, where the scribe could write freely, they left something else entirely. A request, not a demand, not a threat, just a quiet, almost unbearably sincere ask. One scribe, finishing a copy of a work by Paschasius Radburus in the 10th century, ended his manuscript with these words: "Whoever may read this book, pray for the soul of C. Gaston who wrote me." Amen. That is all a namesage. I request that you, whoever you are, whenever you are reading this, wherever you have found yourself in the centuries between his life and yours, that you spare a thought for him. Augustine has been dead for over 1,000 years. His name is otherwise unrecorded in any document we know of. We do not know where he lived, what he looked like, whether he was a young monk or an old one, whether he ever saw the sea or ate anything more interesting than bread. We know only that he wrote a book, and that he hoped someone would remember him. Someone is. There is a question underneath all of this that I have been circling around, and I think it is time to face it directly. We have spent these chapters in the world of the monastery, that specific, enclosed, disciplined, and extraordinary world where most of what was written was also preserved. But by the 12th and 13th centuries, something was beginning to change. The monasteries were no longer the only game in town. Universities were rising across Europe. Secular readers were multiplying. The demand for books was beginning to outrun the capacity of any monastic scriptorum. And into that gap stepped a different kind of person entirely. Not a monk, not a priest, not someone driven by piety or the rule of Saint Benedict. A merchant, a businessman, someone who had looked at the enormous and unsatisfied hunger for books among Europe's growing educated population and thought there is money to be made here. The story of how books became a commercial enterprise, how the economics of knowledge were completely transformed, who profited and who did not, and what that meant for the people who desperately wanted to read is where we're going next, right? Then let us talk about money, because everything we have explored in this series, the parchment made from animal skins, the iron gore ink, the gold leaf from Afghanistan, the years of labor in cold rooms, the illuminators grinding lapis lazuli in a blue that cost as much as gold by weight. All of that had a price, a real specific documented price. And when you look at that price in the context of what ordinary people earned in the Middle Ages, you start to understand something fundamental about why the world before the printing press was the way it was. A single large Bible produced carefully and honestly in 13th or 14th century England could cost as much as a small house or several years of craftsmen's wages. The library of Cambridge University in the year 1424, one of the leading centers of learning in England, contained exactly 122 books, the entire collection. And the university labored for the next 50 years to increase that number to 330. 330 books at one of the most important educational institutions in the country. Let that settle in for a moment before we go on. To understand the economics of the medieval book world, you need to understand how radically different the relationship between cost and access was from anything we know today. We live in a world where a book, even a physical paper book, is something most people in wealthy countries can afford on a whim. Where digital text costs effectively nothing to reproduce. Where a library card gives you access to millions of titles for free. None of that was remotely true before 1450. In the medieval world, the cost of a book was not primarily in the text itself. Nobody owned the words because the concept of copyright did not yet exist. The cost was entirely in the physical production, the materials, and the labor, and both were extraordinarily expensive. Consider just the parchment. A single large folio Bible required somewhere between 150 and 250 calf skins, and those are conservative estimates. Some luxury Bibles required considerably more. Each skin had to be soaked, scraped, stretched, dried, cut, and prepared by skilled craftsmen before it ever reached the scriptorum. Then once the text was written and the illumination was done, the binding required its own materials. Wooden boards, leather, metal clasps. A volume of any size and quality was in material terms alone an enormous investment. Add to that the labor of months or years of copying and illuminating, and you have an object whose value is genuinely comparable to major pieces of real estate or significant livestock holdings. Stealing a book in the Middle Ages, and we talked about the curses this inspired in our last chapter, was not theft of a luxury item. It was closer to stealing someone's house. Now, who could actually own one of these objects? In the early medieval period, the answer was essentially monasteries, churches, royal courts, and the very highest echelons of the aristocracy. Everyone else was effectively excluded, not by law in most cases, but by economics. If you were a merchant or a skilled craftsman earning a decent living, a single book might represent several months or even a year of your income. If you were a peasant, the question was simply irrelevant. This created a world in which knowledge, not just books, but the ideas contained in them, was structurally concentrated in the hands of specific institutions and specific classes of people. The church controlled most of what was written down, what was preserved, and who had access to it. And while individual clergy members had genuinely varied motivations, some deeply committed to learning others to faith, others simply following the rhythms of monastic life. The institutional effect was that the church was the gatekeeper of the written word for several centuries. I think about this sometimes when I am reading something written by a medieval monk. Those complaint notes in the margins, the requests for prayers at the end of manuscripts, the tiny jokes hidden in illuminated borders. These were real human beings with full and complex inner lives. But the system they served was one that, whatever its intentions, kept literacy and book ownership as privileges of the few. And then something began to change. The change began in Italy, spread to France, and then rippled outward across Europe during the 12th and 13th centuries. And the thing that drove it was not a new philosophy or a new technology. It was a very old human institution in a new form, the university. Between roughly 1088, when the University of Bologna is traditionally said to have been founded, and the end of the 13th century, dozens of universities were established across Europe. Bologna, Paris, Oxford, Cambridge, Padua, Naples, Salamanca, Montpellier. Each drew students from across the continent. Young men who came to study law, medicine, theology, philosophy, and the liberal arts, often spending years away from home in pursuit of a degree that would open doors in church, government, and commerce. And every single one of those students needed books. Not display books, not ceremonial Bibles meant for the altar. Practical, workable, usable textbooks, copies of Aristotle's Logic, commentaries on Justinian's legal code, medical texts from the school at Salerno, theological works by Peter Lombard and Thomas Aquinas, philosophy that could be read annotated, argued with, referenced quickly during a lecture or a disputation. The demand was sudden and enormous, and the monasteries, with their careful, slow, individually paced production model oriented around sacred texts, was simply not equipped to meet it. Something entirely new had to emerge. What emerged was the professional stationer. The stationer in Latin, the stationarius, was a merchant who specialized in books and book-created materials. The name comes from the Latin word for standing still, because these tradespeople operated fixed permanent shops, rather than traveling from market to market. They occupied a position that had no real precedent in European history. A commercial middleman in the trade of ideas. By the 13th century in the university cities of Paris and Bologna, especially, there were enough stationers to form organized professional guilds subject to university regulation and required to take oaths about the quality and pricing of their goods. They sold parchment and ink and other materials to students who wanted to write. They bought, sold, and traded secondhand manuscripts. They commissioned professional scribes and illuminators to produce new copies on demand. And they developed a system for doing something that had never quite been done before, providing multiple students with access to the same text at the same time. The system is called the PL, Latin for peace, and it is one of the most elegant and practical solutions to a logistical problem that I have encountered in all of medieval history. Here is how it worked. A stationer would obtain or commission a reliable university-approved master copy of a required text. This master copy, called the exemplar, was then physically divided into sections, each one typically comprising 4 folios, which is 8 pages of writing. These individual sections were numbered sequentially and kept loose and unbound. A student who needed to copy the text would come to the stationer's shop, pay a small rental fee, and take home 1 PCI 1 section. While he copied it, the next student could rent the following section, and the student after that could take the 3rd section. At any given time, multiple students could be working simultaneously on different parts of the same book because they each had a different piece. The rental fee at Bologna was typically charged by the week. You had 1 week to copy your PCO, return it, and collect the next one. If the section you needed was already out, you skipped ahead to the next available piece and left space in your copy for the missing section to be filled in later. This meant that even a very popular text, something that dozens of students simultaneously needed, could circulate continuously with virtually no idle time. The result was that a text which might have taken a single scribe months to copy could be reproduced by a group of students in a fraction of that time. The price regulated by the university was set at levels most students could afford, and the quality of the approved exemplar was checked periodically by university authorities. If a stationer's exemplar was found to be inaccurate, he was fined. Think about what this was in terms of what came before it. This was the medieval equivalent of a library lending system, but one that also enabled reproduction. Students were not just borrowing the text, they were making their own copy, which they could then keep. The Pika system was within the constraints of the preprint world, a small revolution in the democratization of knowledge. The earliest dated evidence of this system comes from a contract in Vercelli in 1228. By the second half of the 13th century, it was a formal regulated procedure at Paris, Bologna, Oxford, and Naples. A Paris list from 1275 recorded the titles and rental prices of 138 works available through the stationer system. By 1304, when the next surviving list was compiled, the catalog had grown considerably. Do you ever wonder what it would have felt like to be a student in 13th century Paris, walking through the narrow streets near the university, past a row of stationer shops with their open stalls and their rolls of parchment and their piles of loose manuscript sections? What it would have meant to walk out with a few folios under your arm, a rented portion of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics, or a section of canon law, and know that somewhere across the city, a dozen other people were doing exactly the same thing with other sections of the same text. It would not have felt like a revolution. It would have felt like Tuesday, but it was. And yet, even the PIA system had limits that are worth being honest about. The students who used it were not the poor. University education in the 13th and 14th centuries required payment for tuition, for lodging, for food, for the rental fees on PC, after Pessier over the course of years of study. The students were predominantly the sons of merchants, landowners, and clergy with sufficient resources to send a child to Paris or Bologna for several years. The system was more accessible than monastic book production, but it was not accessible to everyone. And outside the university world, things were even more restricted. For the ordinary literate person, the merchant who could read his accounts, the minor official who processed documents, the woman of the upper or middle class who had somehow received an education, owning a book was still an aspiration more than a reality. Some people pulled resources. Some families had a single precious volume passed carefully from generation to generation, read and reread until the binding fell apart. Some people simply made do with access to the few books held by the local church or the nearest monastery read on the premises and not taken home. One man understood the situation more vividly and more personally than perhaps anyone else of his age. His name was Richard Deary, and he was Bishop of Durham, one of the most powerful churchmen in 14th century England. He had served as a diplomat, as royal treasurer, as chancellor, and as tutor to the future King Edward III. He traveled extensively across Europe on the king's business, visiting the courts and chanceries and monasteries and bookseller stalls of France, Germany, and Italy. And wherever he went, he bought books. He became, by the standards of his age, an extraordinary collector. He maintained a library in each of his several residences, an unusual practice for the time. He sent agents with advance payments to stationers and booksellers across England, France, Germany, and Italy, instructing them to acquire anything they could find. By the time of his death in 1345, he'd amassed a collection of over 1,500 volumes, an almost unimaginable number for the period. The entire papal library at Aignan at roughly the same time held only a few thousand. Shortly before he died, he wrote a book about his obsession. He called it the Philoblon from the Greek, meaning the love of books. It was finished on his 58th birthday in January of 1345. He died 3 months later in great poverty because he had spent so much on books that his finances were ruined. His entire collection was sold to pay his debts. The Philoblon is one of the most unexpectedly moving books I've encountered in researching this series. It is not a dry catalog or an administrative record. It is a declaration, an argument, a love letter. In it, Deary writes about what books mean and why they matter. In books, I find the dead as if they were alive. In books, I foresee things to come. He argues that no price is too high for a good book. He complains about people who damage manuscripts carelessly, who place wet cups on the pages, who turn down corners, who let dogs chew on the bindings. He even includes careful rules for how students should handle books lent from his proposed library with washed hands seated properly, never placing anything heavy on the open pages. And he makes one of the first recorded arguments for open access to books for the idea that a library should be a place where knowledge circulates rather than being locked away. He planned before his death to donate his entire collection to a new college at Oxford, where students could use the books freely. He died before he could do it. His executives sold everything. There is something both very sad and very recognizable in that. The man who understood the value of books more than almost anyone in his age died, without being able to share them the way he had intended. What Richard saw, and what the stationer system was beginning to demonstrate, was that the hunger for books far exceeded the supply. That there were people who desperately wanted to read, to copy, to study, to own, and that the existing structures were not keeping up with that demand. By the mid-15th century, the gap between what people wanted and what the hand-copying system could provide had become a genuine crisis. The universities were growing. Literacy was slowly, unevenly spreading beyond the clergy and nobility. The idea that knowledge was, or could be something more broadly shared, was beginning to take hold. Into that gap in the decade after 1450 stepped one German goldsmith and his extraordinarily impactful machine. But before we get there, before the press, before the explosion of books, before the world as we know it begins to take shape, there is still a chapter of the preprint story that has not been told. Because while we have focused on how books were made and who could afford them, we have not talked about the books that almost did not make it. The texts that were on the very edge of disappearing forever, and the remarkable, sometimes accidental, sometimes heroic circumstances that brought them back. Where are the lost books hiding? And who and what brought them home? Somewhere in a monastery in Germany in the winter of 1417, a man was doing something that looked to anyone watching completely ordinary. He was looking at books, not reading them exactly, or not yet, just looking, pulling volumes from shelves, checking spines, flipping to the first pages, scanning for names. He moved through the library with the particular intensity of someone who knows exactly what they're looking for, but is not quite sure whether it is there. His name was Poyo Bracciolini. He was 36 years old, a papal secretary by profession, an Italian humanist by passion, and a man who had spent a significant portion of his adult life haunting the libraries of Swiss, French, and German monasteries in search of something most people around him barely knew existed: the lost books of ancient Rome. And on this particular day, in this particular library, he found one that changed the world. What he pulled from the shelf, covered in dust and likely slightly water damaged, was a manuscript that had not been seen by a scholar in centuries, perhaps longer. The name on the first page was Lucretius. The title was Deoram Nura, on the nature of things. A poem of more than 7,000 Latin lines written sometime around 60 before the Common Era, describing the structure of the universe, the nature of matter, the movement of atoms through the void, and a vision of human life stripped of supernatural fear and grounded in the beauty of the physical world. Pojo probably did not fully understand in that cold German monastery what he was holding. He sent it to a friend in Florence for safekeeping. The friend, a fellow humanist named Niccolo de Niccoli, sat on the manuscript for 12 years before returning it, having made his own copy first. By 1473, the first printed edition appeared. By 1500, it was circulating across Europe, and the ideas it contained about atoms, about nature, about the absence of any divine plan in human affairs would quietly fertilize the thinking of Galileo, of Newton, of Darwin, and of Enlightenment philosophers for the next 3 centuries. That book had survived more than 1,400 years in a monastery library. Nobody who put it on that shelf could have known what it contained. Nobody who walked past it for those 14 centuries thought to read it. And Podio Bratolini, rooting through medieval library collections, while the Council of Constance debated ecclesiastical politics in the town nearby, found it by recognizing a name he remembered from a casual reference in Cicero. This is one of the great stories in the history of knowledge, and it is not the only one. Let us slow down for a moment and think about what was actually at stake in the centuries we have been discussing. When the Western Roman Empire collapsed in the 5th century, it did not fall cleanly like a building suddenly dropping. It dissolved over generations trade routes, breaking down cities, shrinking administrative structures, fragmenting literacy, contracting the complex infrastructure of classical civilizations, slowly falling away. And as that infrastructure went, so did much of the written record that depended on it. We talked about the monasteries and their role in preserving texts, but it is important to be honest about the limits of what they saved. The monks preserved what they valued and what fit within their theological and institutional priorities. The great majority of their copying effort went to religious texts, to the church fathers, to liturgical material. Classical literature, poetry, history, philosophy, science received attention, but not reliably, not comprehensively. And even when a text did make it into a monastery library, its survival was not guaranteed. Libraries burned, communities dissolved, floods, and rot and bookworms and war all took their toll. The texts that did not get copied frequently enough that existed in only 1 or 2 manuscripts were perpetually one disaster away from vanishing forever. Of the enormous outpouring of Greek and Roman literature that we know once existed, we know, because later authors referenced it, quoted it, describe it, only a fraction has survived. We have perhaps 8% of the plays of Sophocles. The complete works of Sappho, one of the greatest poets of the ancient world, are gone. We have fragments, a few lucky scraps. The philosophical school of Epicurus, one of the most influential of the ancient world, is known to us almost entirely through secondary sources because none of his own major works survived. Aristotle's dialogues, the polished public-facing literary versions of his ideas, are gone. And what we have instead are his lecture notes preserved because they were used in schools. What we have lost is staggering. What we almost lost is even more so. The survival of the ancient world's written legacy is not, when you look at it carefully, a single story. It is several stories running in parallel, some in monasteries in Ireland, some in Byzantine Constantinople, and one, perhaps the most important one for the history of Europe, in a great library in the city of Baghdad. Let us talk about that one. By the time the Western Roman Empire was fragmented and contracting the Greek-speaking Eastern Roman Empire, what historians call the Byzantine Empire was still thriving, still reading Aristotle and Plato and Euclid in the original Greek, still maintaining libraries and schools that kept the classical tradition alive. But the Byzantine world, preoccupied with its own political and religious struggles, was not particularly energetic about translating this wealth of knowledge into other languages or spreading it westward. What happened next is one of the most extraordinary acts of intellectual rescue in human history, and it came from an entirely unexpected direction. In the 8th and 9th centuries, the Abbasid Caliphate, the great Islamic empire centered in Baghdad, launched what historians now call the translation movement. The Caliph al-Mansur, who founded Baghdad in 762, began collecting philosophical and scientific works from across the known world. His successors continued and expanded this effort. Under the Caliph al-Ma'mun in the early 9th century, the movement became systematic, generously funded, and spectacularly ambitious. Scholars of different faiths, Muslims, Christians, Jews, were brought to Baghdad and paid substantial salaries to translate Greek texts into Arabic. Not just occasionally, not just the most famous names. All of it. Aristotle, Plato, Euclid, Ptolemy, Galen, Hippocrates, Archimedes, works on mathematics, medicine, astronomy, philosophy, logic, engineering, agriculture. A 10th century writer put it this way: in that era, readers of Arabic had access to about the same breadth of Aristotle's thought that readers of English have today. The translators work through multiple layers. The Greek texts were often translated first into Syriac, a language that Christian scholars of the region knew, and then from Syriac into Arabic. Sometimes this process introduced errors or interpretive choices that altered meaning. But what it definitively did was preserve the ideas, lock them into a new language and a new culture that would carry them forward, even as the texts themselves continue to decay in the crumbling libraries of the West. One scholar who deserves to be named here is Hunayn ibn Ishaq, a Notorian Christian physician who worked in Baghdad in the 9th century, and who translated an almost unimaginable volume of Greek medical and scientific text into both Syriac and Arabic. His translations of Galen and Hippocrates became the foundational medical texts of the Islamic world. And later, when the West recovered them through Arabic translations and retranslation into Latin, they became the foundation of medieval European medicine too. One person carrying an enormous portion of the ancient medical canon from one civilization into another. And while this was happening in Baghdad, the broader Islamic world was not merely preserving what it had received. It was building on it. Scholars were adding their own commentaries, their own corrections, their own discoveries. The mathematician Al-Khwarizmi, whose name gives us our word algorithm, worked at the House of Wisdom and developed algebra as a systematic discipline. Ibn al-Haytham made fundamental discoveries in optics. Al-Razi, working in medicine, wrote encyclopedic works that would be used in European universities centuries later. What was happening in Baghdad was not just preservation. It was active, dynamic, creative scholarship, a civilization at the height of its intellectual powers engaging with the inheritance of the ancient world and transforming it into something new. When did this knowledge begin to flow back into Western Europe? Gradually through the 11th, 12th, and 13th centuries, primarily through two routes. One was Spain, where the Muslim and Christian kingdoms rubbed against each other along a long, contested frontier, and where scholars from the Christian north would travel to the great cities of Al-Andalus, Toledo, Cordoba, Seville to access Arabic libraries and find scholars who could help them translate texts back into Latin. The other was Sicily, which had passed from Byzantine to Arab to Norman control and sat at a crossroads of languages and cultures, a place where a single educated person might move between Greek, Arabic, and Latin in a single conversation. The scale of what was transmitted through these routes is remarkable. The complete works of Aristotle, including texts that Western Europe had essentially not seen for 6 or 7 centuries, arrived in Latin through Arabic translations. Euclid's Elements of Geometry, which became a cornerstone of university education throughout the medieval period, came to European scholars through an Arabic to Latin translation. The astronomical and mathematical frameworks that would eventually be challenged and transformed by Copernicus and Galileo were themselves built on Arabic scholarship that had preserved, corrected, and extended ancient Greek science. There's a strange irony in this that I think deserves to be said plainly. The intellectual heritage that Europe claimed as its own, the Greek philosophy and Roman literature that Renaissance thinkers presented as the foundation of Western civilization, was preserved in significant part by the cultures and civilizations that Europeans would spend centuries in conflict with. The Arabic-speaking scholars of Baghdad and Cordoba and Cairo kept Aristotle alive when Europe could not. The Byzantine scholars of Constantinople copied and annotated Greek texts throughout the long centuries when Western Europe had lost the ability to read the originals. The Irish monks on their windswept island outpost copied Latin texts when the monastery networks on the continent were too disrupted to do so reliably. Knowledge does not belong to one civilization. It has always traveled. And this brings us back to Pio Bracciolini, to the German monastery, to the winter of 1417, because what Podio was doing in those years, and he was extraordinarily productive during this period, discovering not just Lucretius, but a complete manuscript of Quintilian's great work on the education of an order law speeches of Cicero, an architectural treatise by Vitruvius, and several other major texts, was the European branch of something that had been going on across many cultures for centuries. He was a book hunter, and he was operating in a tradition of book hunting that stretched back through Richard de collecting manuscripts across the courts of Europe, through the Islamic translators seeking out Greek works in Byzantine libraries, through Cassiodorus collecting everything he could find in the ruins of the late Roman world, through Ashaban sending scribes across his empire to gather tablets for his library in Nineveh. Human beings have always known at some level that knowledge is fragile, that it can be lost, that the civilizations we build are temporary, and what we write down is more durable than we are, but not by as much as we might wish. And so, individuals in every era have taken it on themselves to do the quiet, obsessive, sometimes slightly reckless work of finding and preserving the texts that matter. Poggio characteristically was not above a certain amount of creative acquisition. In at least one documented case, He bribed a monk to extract manuscript from a monastery library without permission. He himself wrote that he could not bear to see valuable texts, rotting away in conditions that even an enemy would not wish on books. He was not always gentle about it, but the results, the texts he found and copied and distributed, are now in libraries and universities across the world, read by scholars and students who have no idea they owe them to a man who rooted through dusty German monastery shelves in the winter of 1417 and recognized a name he half remembered from a quote in Cicero. I want to tell you about one more text before we leave this chapter, one that did not have a Poggio to rescue it, one that almost very nearly was not saved at all. The poem of Lucretius was found because Poggio happened to know the name. But there are many texts where there was no Pio, no lucky recognition, no last-minute rescue. We know this because of what we have lost. The works of Sappho gone, the histories of Theopompus and Timus gone, Aristotle's dialogues, his public writings, the polished face he showed the world gone. Varro, the great Roman scholar who wrote on farming Latin, Roman religion libraries, and a dozen other subjects mostly gone, surviving only in fragments quoted by others. The plays of Menander, the greatest Greek comic playwright of his age, reduced to tiny scraps, until Egyptian papyrus excavations in the 19th and 20th centuries recovered portions of several plays from ancient rubbish heaps. That last point is worth dwelling on because the recovery of classical texts was not finished in the Renaissance. It has continued into our own era. Papyrus documents buried in the sands of Egypt, preserved by the extreme dryness of the climate, have been gradually yielding ancient texts for over a century. In 2008, scholars announced the discovery of new fragments of Sappho on papyrus, adding poems that have been unknown for 2,000 years. The process of recovery is still going on, and this is one of the things I find most moving about the entire story of books before the printing press. The text did not stop wanting to be found, buried under feet of sand, tucked in the backs of monastery shelves, misidentified in library catalogs, cut up and used as binding material. In later books, they waited sometimes for centuries, sometimes for 2 millennia. They waited for someone to look carefully enough to know enough to recognize them, to care enough to copy them out and pass them on. The books that survived did so because of an almost improbable chain of individual decisions, individual acts of recognition and care and effort stretching across centuries and civilizations and languages. Each link in that chain is someone who could have done nothing and chose to do something instead. There is one more chapter in this story before we reach the printing press, and it is a chapter that is rarely told in quite the way it deserves to be. Because while scholars were hunting manuscripts across Europe, while the PCI system was making university textbooks more accessible, while Richard was spending his fortune on books, a quieter and more intimate network had been developing. One that operated not through institutions or wealthy patrons or papal secretaries, but through ordinary individuals, merchants, minor nobles, travelers, students who had found ways to share books with each other across enormous distances. How did books actually travel through medieval Europe? What roads and relationships carried texts from one city to another, from one country to another, from one century to the next? And who were the people often unnamed, often overlooked, who kept the network alive? That is where we go next. Think for a moment about what the medieval world actually looked like on the ground. Not in the libraries or scriptoria we spent so much time in, but out on the roads. The roads of medieval Europe were not empty. They were in fact extraordinarily busy. Merchants moved between cities and trade fairs. Pilgrims walked for weeks and months toward distant shrines. Students traveled from their hometowns to universities hundreds of miles away. Ambassadors carried letters between courts. Merchants hauled goods across mountain passes, and threaded through all of this movement, often unremarked and unrecorded, were books. Books traveled. Before the printing press, before the era when a text could be reproduced in hundreds of identical copies, and distributed through a commercial network, the movement of a single manuscript from one city to another was an act of real significance. It might carry a text that no one in the destination city had ever read. It might contain the only copy of a particular author's work within a radius of several hundred miles. And the person carrying it might be a scholar, a merchant, a pilgrim, a student, or simply someone doing a favor for a friend. This is the chapter we've not told yet. Not the libraries, not the scriptor, not the stationers and their pia, but the roads, the letters, the friendships, the informal personal human network through which knowledge actually moved across medieval Europe. Let us begin with something that feels almost too ordinary to matter until you think about what it meant. Scholars wrote letters to each other. This is not surprising in itself, but the letters they wrote were not just personal correspondence in the modern sense. They were part of a systematic culture of intellectual exchange in which letters served as the primary vehicle for sharing ideas, debating arguments, reporting discoveries, and crucially for borrowing, lending, and tracking down manuscripts. The Italian poet Francesco Petra, known to history simply as Petrarch, was one of the most prolific and influential participants in this culture, and his surviving correspondence gives us an unusually clear window into how it actually worked. Petrarch lived from 1304 to 1374, and during his lifetime, he traveled constantly, maintained friendships with scholars across Italy and beyond, and accumulated what was for the period an extraordinary personal library. But what is fascinating about his letters is not just what they say about books he owned. It is what they reveal about how books moved. He wrote to friends asking if they had particular texts or knew someone who did. He reported manuscripts he had found in monastery libraries. He sent his friends copies he had made himself. He received copies in return. When he discovered Cicero's letters to Atticus in a cathedral library in Verona in 1345, a collection of Cicero's private correspondence that had not been seen by scholars in centuries, his first act was to sit down and make his own copy on the spot by hand. And then he wrote to his network. His closest intellectual companion was Giovanni Boccaccio, the author of the Dameron, and the letters between these two men spanning decades filled with discussions of ancient authors and modern gossip and philosophical arguments, and the occasional health complaint read at their best, like the correspondence of two people deeply in love with the same thing. The possibility that the past could speak to the present, if only you could find the right texts and get them into the right hands. One of the most touching details in Petrarch's will, written in 1374 years before his death, is a bequest of 50 gold florins to Baccio, specifically designated for a warm winter dressing gown. He knew his friend was not wealthy. He wanted to make sure Baccio stayed warm enough to keep working. And when Petrarch died in 1374, he was found at his desk, his head resting on a manuscript by Virgil. There is a kind of completeness in that image that I find genuinely moving. He had spent his life with books. He died with one as his pillow. The network Petrarch participated in was informal, personal, and entirely dependent on individual relationships and the willingness of travelers to carry things. But it was astonishingly effective at moving texts across vast distances. Here is how it worked in practice. A scholar in Florence hears through a mutual acquaintance that a monastery in Cologne has a manuscript of a text he's been looking for. He writes a letter to the abbot of the monastery. The abbot responds perhaps months later saying, "Yes, the text exists," and asking what the scholar can offer in exchange. Negotiations follow. Sometimes a copy of something the monastery lacks. Sometimes a fee. Sometimes simply a promise of reciprocal assistance in the future. A traveling merchant or a student heading north is asked to carry the letter and perhaps the manuscript. The manuscript arrives eventually, sometimes after many months, sometimes damaged from the journey, sometimes not at all because the carrier lost it or sold it or was robbed on the road. This was the reality of long-distance book exchange before the printing press. Uncertain, slow, personal, and profoundly dependent on trust. Medieval scholars worried constantly about the return of borrowed books, and their worries are preserved in the letters that survive. Petrarch himself, who was by all accounts not above holding on to things he had borrowed longer than was strictly polite, wrote letters complaining when his own manuscripts were not returned promptly. His friend Niccolo de Niccoli, the man to whom Poggio Bracciolini sent his famous copy of Lucretius, held on to that manuscript for 12 years before returning it. 12 years. Poggio wrote increasingly irritated letters asking for it back. Niccoli made his own copy first, and apparently did not feel this required much apology. The informal rule was that you could borrow a manuscript to copy it, and then you return the original. The problem was that eventually was doing a lot of work in that sentence. But beyond the world of scholars, there was another circulation network that has received far less attention. from historians, and which I think deserves more. The pilgrims. In the medieval world, pilgrimage was not a minor or marginal phenomenon. It was one of the great organizing experiences of the culture. Every year, tens of thousands of people left their homes and walked sometimes for weeks or months toward the great shrines of Christendom, to Rome, to Jerusalem, to Santiago de Compostela in northwestern Spain, where the relics of the Apostle James were kept, to Canterbury in England, where Thomas Becket had been killed in 1170 and canonized shortly after. These journeys were not made in solitude. Pilgrims traveled in groups for safety as much as for company, and those groups were remarkably diverse. Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, written in the 1380s and 1390s, and one of the most vivid social portraits of the medieval period ever produced, shows us exactly this. A knight and a miller and a doctor and a wife and a monk and a nun and a pardoner and a cook, all walking the same road to Canterbury, all with their different stations and histories and stories to tell. And in those groups, people talked. They exchanged news and gossip and information. They recommended books and sermons and stories. They carried things for each other. The pilgrim roads were, among other things, information highways, slow ones, yes, but highways nonetheless, connecting communities and regions and ideas that had no other reliable means of contact. Serious-minded pilgrims carried prayer books. Some carried portable devotional texts. Some carried letters for monks or scholars at the monasteries that dotted the pilgrimage routes, providing food and shelter to travelers in exchange for news of the wider world, and occasionally a manuscript or two. The monasteries along the pilgrimage roads were not just rest stops. They were nodes in a network. A monk at a monastery on the road to Compostela might have contacts at 20 other monasteries along the route. He received letters and manuscripts. He sent them onward. He hosted scholars who were traveling, and those scholars might spend several days in the monastery library reading and copying whatever they found. The pilgrimage routes were in this sense arteries of knowledge as much as roads of faith. There is a moment in the history of medieval book circulation that I find particularly striking, partly because of who was involved and partly because of how it played out. In the 14th century, the city of Marrakesh in what is now Morocco was said to have a single street lined with approximately 100 booksellers. 100 in a single street. This was not an isolated phenomenon of the Islamic world where, as we touched on in our chapter about lost and found books, the culture of manuscript production and exchange had developed with extraordinary vitality. But it points to something important. The density of the book trade, even in the preprint world, could reach remarkable concentrations in certain cities and along certain routes. In Europe, the equivalent were the great trade fairs. And the most important of these for books was the fair at Frankfurt. Frankfurt had been a center of trade since at least the 12th century, holding twice-yearly fairs that drew merchants from across the continent. By the 14th century, manuscripts were being sold and exchanged at the Frankfurt Fair alongside silk and spices and cloth. The fair was ideally situated at the intersection of major trade routes with river access via the Rhine and the Main, making it possible to transport heavy cargoes of books by boat as well as overland. As the 15th century wore on and printing began to spread, the Frankfurt Fair would transform into the first great center of the printed book trade in Europe, the distant ancestor of the Frankfurt Book Fair that still happens today and is still the world's most important event in international publishing. But before Gutenberg, it was already a place where manuscripts changed hands, where booksellers and scholars from Germany, France, Italy, and the Netherlands converged to buy, sell, and trade. Think about what it meant to walk through the Frankfurt Fair in, say, 1400. Among the stalls of cloth merchants and spice traders and silversmiths, there were tables displaying manuscripts. Some new, some used their pages bearing the evidence of earlier owners' annotations in the margins, the occasional wine stain, perhaps a bookmark made from a strip of parchment. A scholar from Paris might find a text there that no one in France possessed. A merchant from Venice might pick up a legal treatise that his clients needed. The fair was for a few weeks each year one of the most intellectually active places in Europe. But I want to return to something more intimate than trade fairs and pilgrimage routes, because the story of how books traveled in the medieval world is at its heart a story about individuals, specific people making specific choices in specific moments. Let me tell you about one of those moments. In the year 1333, Petrarch was traveling in France and the Low Countries, partly for intellectual tourism, and partly in search of manuscripts. While in the city of Liège, now in modern Belgium, he came across a manuscript containing 2 previously unknown speeches of Cicero. He had no copyist with him. He had no assistant. He sat down and copied both speeches out himself by hand, with fatigue and effort, as he later described it. 2 men helped him with the task, taking turns with the copying to share the labor. They worked through the night. He was a poet, a scholar, a man who had servants who could have done this for him had they been there. But the manuscripts were there, and he was there, and the opportunity might never come again. So he picked up the pen. This is the secret truth of the medieval book network for all its institutional infrastructure: the monasteries, the stationer shops, the trade fairs, the pilgrimage routes. It ultimately depended on individuals who cared enough to do inconvenient things, to stay up all night copying, to carry a heavy manuscript across the Alps in a saddlebag, to write letter after letter asking for the return of something borrowed, to negotiate with a suspicious abbot who was not sure whether to trust a stranger who wanted access to his library. Knowledge did not move itself. People moved it, and they moved it because they believed with varying degrees of articulateness and passion that it mattered, that the loss of a text was a real loss, that a book sitting unread in a monastery library was a kind of waste, the same way a talent buried in the ground is a waste. This conviction that knowledge belongs to everyone who can use it, not just to whoever happens to hold the physical manuscript, is one of the most important ideas in the entire history of books. And it was not invented by the printing press. It predates Gutenberg by centuries. You can see it in the letter networks of the humanists in the PIA system of the universities, in the way Piogio Bracciolini wrote excited dispatches to his friends when he found something remarkable in a monastery library. What the printing press did, and this is crucial to understand, was not invent the idea that knowledge should circulate. It gave that idea a machine, and the story of that machine, of how it came to exist, what it destroyed as well as what it created, and what happened to the scribe who saw his entire world transformed in the space of a single generation, is where we are going next. Because before Gutenberg, everything we've discussed was pointing towards something. The trade fairs, the scholar networks, the stationer system, the growing hunger for books that no monastic scriptorum could satisfy. It was all building toward a moment, and that moment arrived. There's a particular kind of sadness that comes with being the last of something, not the last person to do it. The craft does not die all at once, and there are always those who carry it forward in smaller circles out of love rather than necessity. But the last person to do it at the center of things, the last person for whom it was the main event rather than a beautiful, costly anachronism, the person who kept going while the world changed around them and then had to make a choice. In the story of books before the printing press, that person has a name. His name was Vespasiano Diastichi, and his story is one of the most quietly extraordinary in all of this history we have been traveling through together. But before we get to Vespasiano, we need to talk about the man whose invention made the question of last necessary at all. Johannes Gutenberg was born in Mainz, Germany sometime around 1400. The exact date is not recorded. His family was well connected. His father apparently involved in the local ecclesiastical mint, which gave young Johannes familiarity from an early age with metalworking, with the casting and precision handling of small objects. As a young man, he was trained as a goldsmith and gem cutter. He was not, in other words, a scholar. He was a craftsman. And this matters because the invention that changed the world was not a theoretical insight or a philosophical breakthrough. It was a craft solution to a practical problem. And like many of the great transformative technologies in human history, it did not emerge from a single brilliant moment, but from years of secretive, expensive trial and error experimentation. By the 1430s, Gutenberg was living in Strasbourg and had begun working on something he kept conspicuously vague about with his business partners. Court records from a lawsuit in 1438 mentioned secret arts and experiments and a partnership that had gone wrong, but carefully avoid specifying what exactly those arts and experiments involved. It is only later looking back that we can piece together what Gutenberg was doing, systematically developing a method for printing text using individual metal letters that could be rearranged and reused. The concept of movable type was not new. The Chinese had developed it centuries earlier. Block printing, carving an entire page as a single wood block, had already been practiced in Europe for some decades, producing calendars and simple illustrated texts. But what Gutenberg was inventing was different. A system using individually cast metal letters, designed to be easily reproducible in large quantities, standardized enough that they could be combined in any order and then disassembled and recombined for the next job. The technical problems were formidable. The alloy had to be precise lead, tin, and antimony in proportions that melted quickly and cooled quickly so that letters could be cast in large numbers efficiently. The ink had to be oil-based rather than water-based, because water-based ink would not adhere properly to metal. The press itself, adapted from the agricultural screw presses used for wine and olives, had to apply exactly the right and even pressure across the entire page, consistently enough to produce legible, identical results hundreds of times. Each of these problems required years of experimentation. Each solution was itself an invention. By 1450, Gutenberg had apparently refined his process sufficiently to begin commercial production. And by 1452, he had begun work on the project that would define his place in history, printing the Bible. Now, here's something I think about quite often, and I want to share it with you because it complicates the clean, triumphant narrative we usually tell about the printing press. Gutenberg himself did not experience his invention as a triumph. He borrowed money, enormous sums by the standards of the time, from a wealthy mines financier named Johann F. 800 guilders in 1450, another 800 in 1452. F was not a philanthropist. He was an investor, and he expected returns. As the Bible project stretched on, because producing a Bible was no small undertaking even for a machine, Gutenberg is believed to have printed somewhere between 150 and 180 copies, each running to over 200 pages. The money ran out before the income came in. In 1455, F sued. He won. Gutenberg was ordered to repay the loans plus compound interest, a total that was effectively ruinous. The printing equipment, including the very press that had produced the Gutenberg Bible, passed to Fust and his son-in-law Peter Schoffer, who had worked in the operation as a skilled craftsman. They continued the business. Gutenberg, the inventor, was left with little. He eventually received some recognition. The Archbishop of Mainz granted him a modest court pension near the end of his life, and he may have continued printing on a smaller scale. But the man who fundamentally altered the course of human civilization died in 1468, probably in relative obscurity, certainly not rich, and with no children. The business that bore his invention belonged to someone else. History sometimes has a very dark sense of irony. But what happened next in the 50 years following 1455 was by any measure staggering. The numbers tell the story most efficiently. Before Gutenberg, the total number of books in all of Europe has been estimated at somewhere around 30,000. By 1500, just 45 years after the Gutenberg Bible, there were somewhere between 10 and 12 million books on the continent. From 30,000 to 12 million in 45 years. By the same year, there were printing shops in approximately 60 German cities. Presses had been established in Venice, Paris, Basel, Bruges, Oxford, and dozens of other cities across the continent. German printers who knew the technology first traveled as missionaries of the new craft, setting up operations wherever they found buyers. From 1450 to 1500, it is estimated that somewhere between 20 million books were printed across Europe. 20 million in 50 years, when the entire previous millennium had produced perhaps a few hundred 000 manuscripts. This was not just a change in technology. It was a change in the nature of what a book was. Before the press, every book was unique, the specific product of a specific human being's hands, carrying in its pages the evidence of that person's labor, their errors, their personality. After the press, 2 copies of the same edition were for practical purposes identical. The word had been standardized, the text had been fixed, and for the first time in history, it became possible to correct an error in one edition and guarantee that every subsequent copy would have the correction. This mattered enormously. The accumulation of scientific knowledge, the ability to build on what previous generations had discovered without each generation having to start from scratch with corrupted copies of corrupted copies, was suddenly possible in a way it had never been before. The scientific revolution of the 16th and 17th centuries was built in part on the ability of scientists to share standardized, reliable texts with each other across Europe. And yet something was also lost. And I want to spend a little time with that, because I think the loss is often glossed over in the celebration of what the press gave us. and it deserves to be named. The manuscript book at its finest was not just a container for text. It was an object, a specific physical, irreplaceable object with a history and a personality. Every illuminated manuscript that has come down to us is different from every other one. The gold leaf catches the light at a different angle. The blue of the Virgin's robe is a slightly different shade of lapis. The marginalia, those tiny human notes we talked about earlier in this series, reveal a specific mind in a specific moment, responding to specific words. When you hold a medieval manuscript, you're holding something that no two people in history have ever held in identical form. That is extraordinary, and it disappeared almost completely within a generation of the printing press. There is a man who felt this loss more personally and more eloquently than perhaps anyone else of his era. Vespasiano d'Asti was born in 1422, the son of a wool merchant who died young and left his family in debt. At 11 years old, Vespasiano went to work in a bookshop on the street of booksellers in Florence. He bound books. He ran errands. He learned the trade from the inside out, not as a scholar, but as a craftsman and a businessman. By the 1440s, he had his own shop, and by the 1450s, he was becoming known as something extraordinary, a man who could source any text, produce any manuscript, connect any scholar or wealthy patron with the books they needed. A friend called him the king of the world's booksellers. This was not hyperbole. Vespasiano's operation was remarkable in its scope. When Cosimo de' Medici, the patriarch of the most powerful banking family in Florence, decided to stock the library of the monastery of San Marco in 1444, he turned to Vespasiano. Vespasiano engaged 55 scribes and illuminators working simultaneously and completed 200 superb manuscripts in under 2 years. Think about what that means. 200 distinct, individually produced, individually illuminated books in 24 months from a single coordinating intelligence. When Federico de Montefeltro, the Duke of Urbino, decided he wanted a great library worthy of his court, he turned to Vespasiano. The project took 14 years. Vespasiano supplied over 900 volumes. He organized the collection, compared it against the catalogs of the Vatican Library, the Library of San Marco, and the University Library at Oxford to ensure the Duke had what other great collections lacked. Vespasiano's clients included popes, kings, cardinals, ambassadors, and scholars from across Europe. His bookshop became a salon, a gathering place where the intellectual life of Florence passed through on its way to wherever it was going. He was not particularly well educated himself. His Latin was modest, but he understood books, and he understood the people who wanted them, and he understood the network that connected the two. He was, in other words, the culmination of everything the preprint book world had been building toward, the most skilled, most connected, most prolific producer of manuscripts that the manuscript era ever produced. And then the printing press arrived in Italy. For a while, Vespasiano held on. Florence was unusual in this regard. His reputation and the quality of his manuscripts was such that wealthy Florentine patrons continued to commission handwritten books even as printing spread elsewhere. The Duke of Urbino was reportedly so committed to the beauty of the handwritten page that he refused to allow a printed book in his library. Vespasiano is said to have declared that one printed volume would have been ashamed in the company of handwritten books. But eventually the economics were simply inarguable. A printed book could be produced for a fraction of the cost of a manuscript. It could be reproduced in hundreds or thousands of identical copies. It could be purchased by people who could never have afforded one of Vespasiano's elegant productions. The democratization of the book, the thing that the PI system and the university station RAI and the informal scholar networks had been moving toward for 2 centuries, finally arrived definitively with the press, and Vespasiano could not compete with it. In 1478, or by some accounts 1480, he closed his shop on the street of booksellers in Florence and retired to the countryside. He was in his late 50s. He had been in the book trade for nearly 50 years. He had produced hundreds of some of the most beautiful manuscripts ever made. And now he had nothing to do. So he did what any person with a deep sustained knowledge of their world would do given time and silence. He wrote it down. He spent his retirement composing a collection of biographies of the famous men he had known. Popes, humanists, merchants, soldiers, prelates. the entire cast of characters who had passed through his bookshop over half a century. The work is called the Vitae Divini Illustri, the lives of illustrious men of the 15th century. It is one of the most valuable primary sources we have for the intellectual and social world of Renaissance Florence. It was not published in his lifetime. The manuscript sat in obscurity until it was discovered in the Vatican Library in the 19th century. When it was finally published, it inspired the great historian Jacob Burckhardt to write his foundational work on the civilization of the Renaissance. Vespasiano's last great work, a memorial to the world the printing press was replacing, was itself saved from oblivion and brought to the world's attention by a man working in a library. The irony is almost too perfect. What is the right way to think about this transition? Because I have been sitting with this question for a long time, and I do not think the answer is simple. The printing press gave the world more books than it had ever had. It made knowledge accessible to people who'd been structurally excluded from it for centuries. It enabled the Reformation, which broke the Church's monopoly on biblical interpretation and put the scriptures into the hands of ordinary people in their own languages. It enabled the scientific revolution by making it possible for researchers across Europe to share and build on each other's work in standardized, reliable form. It enabled the Enlightenment. It enabled ultimately the world we live in now. A world where literacy is the norm rather than the privilege. Where books are measured in millions and billions rather than tens of thousands. All of that is true. All of that is real. All of that is staggering in its magnitude. And the medieval manuscript tradition, the thing that the printing press displaced, was also genuinely limited. Its beauty was real, but it was the beauty of objects created for and accessible to the wealthy few. The knowledge it preserved was preserved unevenly driven by the priorities of the institutions that controlled it. The scribes who made it suffered for it complained about it in their margins, froze in their cold rooms, and acted in their cramped hands. It was a system that worked up to a point through an extraordinary concentrated effort of human attention and patience, and it was not enough. The hunger for books always outran what it could produce, but something genuinely irreplaceable did go with it. The individual handwriting, the specific mark of a specific human being on a specific page on a specific day. The gold that caught the candlelight in the monastery chapel, the marginalia, the complaints, the tiny jokes, the name at the end of the manuscript asking whoever reads this to pray for my soul. When the press replaced the scribe books became cheaper and more plentiful and more consistent. They also became in some essential way anonymous. The standardized page has no personality. The mass-produced letter has no hand. We gained something almost immeasurable. We also lost something that was in its own way beyond price. And so, I find myself returning at the end of this chapter to where we began this whole journey, to the question of what it means to want to preserve something, to give a thought or a feeling or a discovery, a body that will outlast the moment in which it was born. Every form this took across the centuries, we have explored the clay tablet pressed by hand in Mesopotamia, the papyrus scroll unrolled in Alexandria, the parchment page illuminated with gold and lapis lazuli in an Irish monastery, the borrowed piece by a shivering student in Paris, the manuscript hunted down in a German abbey by a man who recognized a name from Cicero. Every single one of these was driven by the same urgent human conviction that what we know and feel and discover matters, that it deserves to last. The printing press did not invent that conviction. It just gave a machine. And speaking of things that last, there is one final chapter in the story before the press takes over entirely. Because what happened to the very first books that came off Gutenberg's press tells us something remarkable about the world that was being replaced. The early printers with their new technology deliberately made their books look like manuscripts. They left blank spaces for illuminated initials. They hired rubricators to add the red headings by hand. They printed in Gothic type that mimicked the handwriting of the German scriptorum. Why? Because the people buying books had grown up in a world of manuscripts, and they knew what a book was supposed to look like. And what a book was supposed to look like was the thing that Vespasiano had spent his life making. The transition was not a clean break. It was a gradual unfolding, a long farewell to the handmade world, one beautiful, impractical, irreplaceable page at a time. And that farewell, that slow passage from one world to the next, is where we find ourselves now, standing at the threshold, looking back at everything the scribe's hand built and forward at everything the press was about to make possible. The story of what we chose to keep, what we chose to transform, and what we let go. That is where we are headed now. We have come a very long way together. We started in Mesopotamia in the mud of the Tigris and Euphrates, watching a student press a reed into wet clay and leave behind the first tentative marks of what would become writing. We traveled to Egypt, where papyrus turned the written word into something you could carry. We stood at the entrance of the Library of Alexandria, where the world's knowledge was gathered by any means necessary, purchased, borrowed, confiscated from ships traded for silver. We sat in cold scriptorums and listened to monks complain in their margins. We held the Book of Kells in imagination and marveled at what human hands could do when they believed the work was sacred. We followed Podio Brazzolini through snowy German monastery libraries and watched him recognize a name from a footnote in Cicero. We borrowed Pedia by Pescia in the shadow of NRAM. We walked the street of booksellers in Florence and visited Vespasiano's shop where popes and dukes came for the most beautiful books in the world. And now we've arrived at the cradle of something new. The word they used for the first printed books was incunabula. It comes from the Latin word for swaddling clothes, the strips of cloth that newborns are wrapped in to keep them warm and contained in those first fragile hours of life. The first infancy of printing, the first 50 years. I love that word because it acknowledges without apology that what was being born was new and uncertain and had not yet found its own form. The incunabula are books that do not entirely know what kind of book they are. And looking at them today in libraries and archives across the world, about 30,000 editions survive from that first half-century. You can see this uncertainty written into every page. Gutenberg designed his type to look like the handwriting of the German scriptor. The Gothic letter forms he used were the forms that German scribes had developed over 2 centuries. The same letter forms you would find in any German monastery Bible of the period. He was not trying to invent a new visual language. He was trying to replicate an existing one at speed and at scale. The first copies of the Gutenberg Bible came off the press without illumination. Blank spaces had been left for the initial letters, the large decorated capitals at the beginning of each section. These would be added by hand, afterward by a rubricator. The borders, the illuminated decorations, the color, all of this was still done by a human being with a brush after the mechanical text had been laid down. What Gutenberg produced was in a very real sense a mechanized version of the scriptorum, not a replacement for it, but a collaboration between the machine and the hand. For decades after the press arrived, manuscript production continued alongside it. Many wealthy buyers preferred manuscripts precisely because they were handmade. The Duke of Urbino, Vespasiano's great patron, reportedly refused to allow a printed book into his library. Some collectors felt sincerely and not unreasonably that a printed book lacked the dignity and uniqueness of the handwritten page. What eventually tipped the balance was not quality. It was quantity and price. A printed book cost a fraction of what a manuscript cost. It could be produced in hundreds of identical copies in the time it took a scribe to complete a single volume. And as the price of books fell, the number of people who could own them rose slowly, unevenly with enormous variation by region and class and language, but steadily and then dramatically. By 1500, there were printing shops in cities across the whole of Europe, from Lisbon to Krakow, from Stockholm to Palmo. The presses were operating in at least 236 towns and cities, and the books they produced, those incunabula, those swaddling, clothed infants of print, numbered somewhere in the millions. Let me tell you what I find most moving about this entire period, this 50-year hinge of history between manuscript and print. It is a detail about the Gutenberg Bible itself. When Gutenberg set out to print his Bible, the project he spent years and borrowed fortunes on the project that was supposed to be his masterwork, his demonstration of what the press could do. He designed it to look exactly like a manuscript. Gothic type, 2 columns, 42 lines per page, blank spaces for the illuminated initials. The format, the proportion, the very feel of the pages, all of it was drawn from the manuscript tradition. Gutenberg was not trying to make something new. He was trying to make something old faster. And here is the detail that stops me every time I think about it. In March of 1455, a man named Anna Silvio Piccolomini, who had later become Pope Pius II, wrote a letter in which he described having seen pages from the Gutenberg Bible at the Frankfurt Fair. He reported that the type was so clean and clear that it could be read without glasses. He reported that the pages were uniform, beautiful, consistent. He was describing a revolution. but he described it in the language of a man who was measuring the new thing against the old. The highest compliment he could think to give the most impressive thing about the printed Bible was that it looked so much like a really good manuscript. That is the moment the old world and the new world touched each other. And I love that the man who witnessed it reached for the vocabulary of the thing being replaced to describe the thing replacing it. There's one more figure I want to bring into this final chapter before we close. Because the transition from manuscript to print was not just a story about technology. It was a story about people who had to decide what to do with a craft they had spent their lives mastering in the face of a machine that made that craft obsolete. The scribes, what happened to them? The answer, as with most things in history, is complicated and not entirely happy. Many professional scribes were absorbed into the early printing industry. They became typesetters, correctors, compositors. The skills that had made a good scribe precision and nigh for letterform's knowledge of the text being copied. The ability to catch errors translated surprisingly well into the New World. Peter Schoffer Gutenberg's employee and son-in-law was himself a trained calligrapher, and he brought those skills directly into the printing operation. He is believed to have designed some of the first printing typefaces. Others, the illuminators, especially found work continuing to add decoration to printed books for another generation. The incunabula needed their initial letters painted, their borders drawn, their illustrations colored. This work kept the illuminators busy for decades after the press arrived, even as the demand for it was slowly declining. But there was a third group, the scribes, who refused, who continued to copy text by hand, not because there was an economic market for it, but because they believed, as Vespasiano believed, as the Duke of Urbino believed, that the handmade thing was fundamentally different from the machine-made thing, and that this difference mattered. Some of these people were simply conservative, attached to a familiar world, and unable to adapt. But some of them understood something real. They understood that when a book goes from being a unique object made by a specific human being to being one of 500 identical copies, something has changed, not in the text, but in the relationship between the reader and the page. The manuscript asks you to hold something irreplaceable. The printed book asks you to read. These are not the same thing. I'm not saying one is better than the other. I am saying they are different. And the people who noticed the difference were not wrong to notice it, even if they were ultimately powerless to stop what was coming. So what finally do we take from all of this? We have spent the better part of several hours in a world that no longer exists. A world where a single book could take a year to make and cost as much as a house. A world where knowing how to read was a form of power so rare and so coveted that people went to school for a decade just to hold a quill correctly. A world where the survival of a text depended entirely on whether a specific human being in a specific cold room on a specific day chose to pick up a pen. That world is gone. And we should be glad it is gone, because the world that replaced it brought knowledge to people who had never had access to it, and literacy to populations that had been structurally excluded from it, and the accumulation of shared human understanding across generations that has produced everything we know and everything we value in our civilization. But there is something else the journey through that lost world can give us if we are willing to receive it. A sense of what it cost. Not in money, though the money was staggering. Not in time, though the time was immeasurable, but in human attention. In the specific, focused, irreplaceable gift of one person deciding that this word, this page, this book deserved their most careful hands. Think about the Irish monk on Lindisfarne placing 10,000 individual red dots one by one into the decorative border of a page that most people who ever looked at it would never examine closely enough to count. Think about the girl in the German monastery at Dalheim pressing her brush to her tongue to keep the point fine. The lapis lazuli from Afghanistan leaving traces in her teeth that a scientist would find 900 years later. Think about Sigstan finishing his manuscript in the 10th century and writing at the end, "Whoever reads this, pray for my soul." These were people who believed that what they were doing mattered enough to give it everything. Every physical limitation they had, the cold, the poor light, the cramped hands, the exhausted eyes. And they kept going anyway because they understood that the words on the page were worth more than the comfort of the body that was putting them there. I think about that a lot, especially in a world where text is generated, instantly reproduced, infinitely consumed and discarded and forgotten. I think, what would it mean to treat a page as if it were worth that? There is a line Vespasiano wrote in his retirement in the Tuscan countryside after the printing press had swept away his world. He had closed his shop. He had watched the trade he had spent his life perfecting become, almost overnight, commercially irrelevant. He had made his peace with it more or less. And he wrote, "All evil is born from ignorance. Yet writers have illuminated the world, chasing away the darkness." He meant scribes, of course. He meant the people with quills and ink pots. But I think the sentence is larger than he intended. I think every person who has ever sat down to try to make a thought into something permanent, something transmittable, something another human being can receive. Every person who has ever believed that getting the words right mattered is somewhere in that sentence. Writers have illuminated the world, chasing away the darkness. Not just manuscript illuminators, not just monks, not just Petrarch and Boccaccio and Poyo and Vespasiano. All of them. The Sumerian scribe pressing a reed into wet clay at dawn. The Egyptian scribal student practicing on limestone flakes because papyrus was too expensive. The anonymous hand that wrote "God help my hands" at the bottom of a completed page. The woman in Dalheim whose name we will never know, licking her brush in the lamplight of a monastery scriptorum. All of them chasing away darkness. And here is where I want to leave you tonight. You've been with me for a very long time on this journey. Longer than most bedtime stories go, I will admit. We have traveled more than 5,000 years and half the globe. From the clay tablets of Nineveh to the printing shops of mines. From the deserts of Egypt to the libraries of Baghdad. From the forests of Ireland to the street of booksellers in Florence. What I hope you are taking from this journey, beyond the fascinating specific facts, beyond the strange and wonderful stories, beyond the monks and their complaints, and the book curses and the lapis lazuli in a dead woman's teeth, is something simpler and more enduring. The book you hold, or the screen you read on, or the words you hear spoken to you. These things are the end of an extraordinarily long chain of human effort and human belief. Every link in that chain was a person who thought the words were worth the trouble, who thought that preserving knowledge was worth cold hands and sore backs and years of their life, who thought that you, the future reader, the person they would never meet, deserved to have access to what they knew. You were the reason they did it. Every single one of them in their cold rooms, in their warm shops, in their Baghdad libraries, in their island scriptor, they were working toward you, toward the moment when a human being on whatever night this is for you, wherever you are in the world, has access to more accumulated human thought than any person in history before them. That is not small. That is one of the most remarkable things that has ever happened. Thank you. A thank you for spending this time with me, for staying through the long journey, for being the kind of person who wants to understand where the things we take for granted actually came from. If this story moved you, or surprised you, or made you see a book differently than you did before, if you found yourself thinking about a scribe's cold hands, or a monk's marginalia, or Vespasiano closing his shop and walking away from everything he knew, that worked. That is exactly what I was hoping for. And if you're the kind of person who leaves a comment, I would love to know which part of this journey stayed with you. The clay tablets, the Islamic scholars of Baghdad, the lapis lazuli, the book curses. Because I read everyone, and your responses genuinely matter to me. There are more stories where this one came from. Equally long, equally rich, equally full of the kind of history that makes you see the world differently after you've heard it. The next one is already waiting. Sleep well. Dream of books.